The Virtual Boy is famous for being one of Nintendo's most visible and shortest-lived commercial failures. Released in the summer of 1995 in only Japan and North America, the Virtual Boy simulates 3D images with a visor display, rendered in monochromatic black and red. It was widely considered to be uncomfortable for both the eyes and the back, and was discontinued in both regions around half a year later with 22 games released. Personally, I kinda like the Virtual Boy, at least for its hardware. The 3D effect is clean and convincing, and it's not all that uncomfortable if you play it lying down. Nintendo tried its hand at 3D again about a decade and a half later, with the 3DS in 2011. The effect was well received, though 3D is still not to everyone's liking. But Nintendo's history with 3D gaming actually extends back to 8 years before the Virtual Boy, for use on a home console. This is the Famicom 3D system. The Famicom 3D system hit Japan in 1987 and was never released for its overseas counterpart, the Nintendo Entertainment System. The visor easily straps around the player's head, leaving plenty of room for regular glasses underneath. The cord plugs into a little box with a 3.5mm headphone-style jack, and then into the Famicom's expansion port. Most compatible games activate 3D mode by hitting the select button during gameplay. Viewers without the 3D visor will see a flickery image like this. The visor works its magic by rapidly covering each eye alternately, so that when the image meant to be seen by the left eye is on screen, the right eye is covered, and vice versa. The visor syncs up to the timing standards of CRT televisions used in Japan and North America, so unfortunately, the effect is impossible on modern displays. But what's cool is that today, you can actually view the 3D effect in higher quality than was ever intended to be possible thanks to the NES RGB mod. And yeah, the 3D effect does work. It's pretty neat considering the age of the technology. It's far from perfect though. The visor darkens your vision considerably and adds a rapid strobing effect that isn't exactly the most pleasing thing in the world. But does it make the games any better? Only 8 3D Famicom games were ever released, 4 of them as cartridges and the other half on the Famicom disk system. Let's take a look at all of them. 3D Hot Rally is the only game that Nintendo itself released for the Famicom 3D system. Co-developed by HAL and Nintendo's EAD, it's also the first game that Satoru Iwata and Shigeru Miyamoto worked on together. It's loosely part of a series of Nintendo racing games that only incidentally star Mario and other Nintendo characters. A precursor to Mario Kart? Well, maybe sorta. But perhaps most notably, this Famicom Disk System exclusive is the first game with artwork featuring Luigi in his modern style. Taller and skinnier than Mario, with a distinctly different mustache. 3D Hot Rally has only 3 courses, but a big part of the fun, at least back in the day in Japan, was to submit course times to Nintendo to win prizes in official competitions via Famicom fax machine installations throughout the country. Scenery along the courses feature grumpy boulders, snakehead lampposts, and horrifying bushes. Was Miyamoto going through a tough time? Each course also features many branching paths, so you'll want to learn a route that best works for your vehicle and driving style. And they're long, well over 10 minutes, so the race against the clock can get pretty intense. At the start of a course, you'll choose an automatic repair point where your vehicle instantly recovers from damage, if you remember to take the right route to reach it. If you're not gonna make it, you can have Mario and Luigi waste a few seconds while they patch things up. Hitting up and down shifts gears. Automatic isn't exactly my specialty, but this wasn't difficult. If you collect enough H icons, then you get a special temporary highest gear. Alright, we're going hot! Whoa! I just love the air that you can get off the hills. It's crazy how this more primitive 3D scaling trick allows for such varied terrain as opposed to the flat Mode 7 racers we got on the SNES. Overall short on content, but still a fun 8-bit racer. Attack Animal Gakuen, literally Attack Animal Academy, was the first Famicom 3D cart that I came across. I was so fascinated by its completely ridiculous label art that I just had to give it a shot. Note to publishers, if your artwork features alligators falling from the sky, I will play your game. Well, what we've got here is the most blatant Space Harrier ripoff imaginable. I mean, look at this! So you're this schoolgirl flying around for some reason, shooting a gun at kangaroos, skeletons with sunglasses, and yes, flying alligators. The first boss is a koala dressed like a 1920s gangster. I mean, that's amazing! But starting with the level 2 boss, the game feels like it's already blown the best of its absurdity, and it also becomes nearly unplayable due to how difficult it is to dodge the sheer number and speed of the things hurtling toward you at all times. It's even worse considering the game has no continues. I had to resort to playing on the Retron 5 with save states to record all of the footage that I wanted, which seriously diminished my enjoyment of the game. And of course, the 3D effect only works on original hardware. It looks pretty good, though the sprite scaling isn't smooth enough to completely sell the effect of enemies and shots coming at you. Attack Animal Gakuen is an interesting oddity, but even if it had continues, that wouldn't have saved it from its troublesome aiming and cluttered boss fights. The 3D Battles of World Runner! In North America, 3D World Runner came packaged with a pair of red and blue 3D glasses, kinda like these. But in Japan, it was released on the Famicom Disk System, and is compatible with the 3D system. The Japanese title is Tomodachi Daisakusen, or Operation Jump Out. 3D World Runner was developed by a young and struggling Square, designed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, composed by Nobuo Uematsu, and programmed by Nasser Jabeli, the team that would go on to create Final Fantasy. Since I'm playing the NES cartridge adapted to the Famicom, hitting the select button won't activate the shutter effect on the 3D visor. To be honest, the red and blue 3D effect in the North American version doesn't really seem to work for me. 3D World Runner certainly has an interesting look. It's very colorful and fanciful. You can speed up and slow down by holding up or down on the D-pad, and you just run forward, dodging enemies. You'll fly around and shoot a giant snake boss at the end of stages, Space Harrier style. It's not a terrible game, but I was getting really frustrated and losing interest in World 2. Upon restarting, I discovered that bumping into columns is a good thing? Well, it's kinda funny, but this is how you get power-ups. But don't grab mushrooms, those'll kill ya. This kind of renewed my interest in the game for a bit, but then there were these horrible giant gaps in World 3, and I felt I'd had enough. It's certainly an interesting game, and I don't hate it, but I don't feel compelled to play much more. Sakaguchi and his crew weren't done with 3D yet. Rad Racer may be best known for its appearance in the infamous Power Glove scene in The Wizard, but the Japanese version, Highway Star, features support for the Famicom 3D system. Highway Star actually released before 3D Hot Rally, and has a really excellent sense of speed, and I feel like superior perspective scaling. The controls are also a lot simpler, but that doesn't mean it's easier. With 8 visually varied stages and no second chances, getting to the end of Highway Star is a daunting task. Thankfully, it does have a simple continue cheat and a level select code if you want to practice any course. Similar to 3D Hot Rally, you're not actually racing against other cars on the track, but just trying to hit checkpoints without running out of time. There's really not much to say about Highway Star / Rad Racer, but it is strangely fun. The 3D perspective is excellent, and the 3D visor effect works fairly well, though I feel it adds little in the way of improved depth perception. The car just has a great feel to it and is really a pleasure to control. I can see the appeal for 80s kids who couldn't drive just yet. But that's not all from Square. You know the famous story about how Sakaguchi's games prior to Final Fantasy hadn't sold all that well? Well, Square was the only company to create more than one 3D system title, let alone 3. Sakaguchi's last game prior to Final Fantasy was a sequel to 3D World Runner, released only in Japan as JJ. This is intended to be like a dark and more hardcore version of Tomodachi Daisakusen. Gone are the cute and colorful enemies, and there's only one speed: fast. And yet, I found the game to actually be quite a bit more compelling. The single speed made it easier to get into a groove, and the large gaps that made World 3 so frustrating in the first game actually became somewhat manageable in JJ. One-ups are more plentiful, and overall it just comes across as a better game. I get the sense that there's a bit of intentional humor here. The tough and gritty atmosphere is almost over the top, and it kinda clashes with the goofy gameplay. Is it just me, or does Jumpin' Jack kinda look like Big Boss? The quality of the 3D effect is also one of the finest on the Famicom 3D system. I didn't finish, and I imagine it would eventually frustrate me to no end, but if I do put more time into a World Runner game, this will be the one. Falzian is a Famicom Disk System game developed by Konami. Now I'm pretty sure those guys knew how to make a space shooter, yeah? Whoa, jeez! Now I've never seen a starry space background like this before, and with good reason. The graphics look even worse in 3D. Just like with the 3DS, dark scenes tend to show 3D ghosting more easily than bright colors. This is especially problematic because it's supposed to look like your ship is popping out in front of the screen, which totally threw off my ability to focus on the rest of the image. The screen darkening that's inherent from viewing through the visor also makes the dark shots you're supposed to dodge extremely difficult to see. Thankfully, the background does change after the first level, and you do have a few continues, but the perspective and scaling was so poor that I never found myself having any fun, and I didn't make it very far. Alright, Cosmic Epsilon, now this game looks pretty rad!
Good luck!
Whoa! Does that voice take up half the cart? Hey, actually, this one seems pretty good. And listen to this music, it sounds straight out of Mario Galaxy. I later learned that this is actually a straight-up cover of a Japanese pop song called Parachute Lemon. No idea if they went through the proper channels, but it's super catchy. I really like the look of this game. I think the textured ground effect is pretty great, And watch how the perspective shifts slightly left and right with your character. That's neat! The 3D effect in Cosmic Epsilon is probably the best on the system, thanks to the generally bright graphics and surprisingly smooth enemy scaling. Aiming is also easier than in Falzion or Attack Animal Gakuen. But sadly, just like Attack Animal Gakuen, what starts off looking super promising becomes almost impossible by the second level. This is not a particularly short game, and the difficulty ramps up to the extreme very quickly. It has no continues and exceedingly scarce opportunities for extra lives. Without any sort of upgrade system or more robust dodge mechanics to balance out this level of challenge, Cosmic Epsilon is far too difficult to be much fun past the first level. And that's a real shame because by playing on the Retron 5, I got to see some pretty cool stuff. Check out the last level on the Battle Moon Aria. How awesome is that? And who knew the NES could pull off an amazing Death Star trench run? With just a few smart tweaks, this could have been a real hidden gem. I guess developers were having a hard time coming up with ideas for 3D visuals other than shooters, racers, and runners. Well, we've got one more 3D game, and this one is actually quite a bit different. Fuan Shaolin something. Well, it's a fighting game by Jaleco. It even has a 2-player mode. Seems maybe kind of advanced for its time? I'm gonna be honest with you. I have absolutely no skill in this genre, so I can't fairly praise or condemn it, but it seems like it might be kinda neat. There's story scenes that I can't read at all, but I like how there's actually branching paths that determine what fight comes next. But man, the computer just tears me to shreds in no time at all, and I was never able to pull off any of the fancy moves that I think the manual is detailing. As you might expect, all the 3D does in this game is make the backgrounds look like they're farther away. It's kind of neat to see 3D used in more of a mundane manner, even if it doesn't really add anything to the game at all. Whew! So that's all of the games that support the Famicom 3D system. I wish I could say more good things about them, but sadly most of them are flawed to some greater or lesser degree. My top recommendation is 3D Hot Rally, which is pretty neat regardless of whether you're using the 3D visor or not. So yeah, maybe not the best selection of games, and sure, the technology is a bit dated, and it's more of a novelty than a gameplay enhancer, but it is amazing to see something like this from that time, and it does actually work. When Rare and Nintendo released GoldenEye for the N64, it defied all expectations. A movie license that not only showed how a first-person shooter could be done right on a home console, but also pushed the genre forward in its own way. GoldenEye was the first-person shooter to ever pique my interest. It also served as a gateway for getting me into the Bond films. At the time, it was considered a travesty in the Nintendo world when Rare was not developing the game based on Tomorrow Never Dies, and it was going to be a PlayStation game to boot. But Nintendo fans weren't completely out of luck. A Game Boy game simply called James Bond 007 released only half a year after GoldenEye. I remember it being pretty decent, and I would expect that a lot of people did play it, but absolutely no one ever talks about it. So let's revisit James Bond on the Game Boy. James Bond 007 was developed by Utah-based developer Sapphire and released by Nintendo in early 1998. I'm sure many people ignored it because it wasn't something on the level of a handheld GoldenEye, but it does draw inspiration from a very worthy source. Anyone who's played the Game Boy Zelda games will see that the base gameplay is heavily inspired by Link's Awakening, a winning formula if ever there was one. The plot is extremely basic. Bond is on a mission to uncover an arms cartel. Starting in China, the game takes 007 to the Middle East, Africa, Tibet, and Russia. What's fun is that despite the game being developed during the Pierce Brosnan era, James Bond on the Game Boy features a non-specific Bond, and feels more like the world of the 60s and 70s Bond films. Sure, they could have done better than recycling Oddjob and Jaws as henchmen, and why are they so freaking huge? But all the same, I do get the sense that the developers had fun getting a chance to work in the Bond universe. Bond drops a few lame puns, and there's even some Q-Lab gags. And the music is pretty great. Nothing wrong with overusing the Bond motif if you ask me. Your first objective is kind of silly and very video gamey. You have to find a carpenter's hammer so he can repair a bridge. Maybe a bit out of place in the world of James Bond, but this is largely a game about gathering information and figuring out how to get what you want out of people. Which is kind of a good idea for a Bond game, don't you think? I mean, sure, Bond has a license to kill, but with most of his games having been shoot-'em-ups of some form or other, this puzzle and mystery-solving element feels like it gets at an important facet of Bond that the shooter format doesn't do as well. In fact, combat is definitely the game's weakest aspect. Though Bond has a pistol and a few other guns, they're a bit difficult to use. You pick up a shield very late in the game, but otherwise there's not much you can do to protect yourself in a gunfight other than awkwardly dodging and abusing hitboxes. Fighting against melee-type enemies is a much more pleasant experience, though a bit too simple to be interesting. Bond's melee weapons are only his fists and a machete, which, interestingly enough, can be used to cut grass, just like in Zelda. Melee is probably the easiest way to fight in most situations, even against enemies with guns. Just equip a bulletproof vest and charge on in, hacking away. It's actually kind of bizarre when you really stop to think about it. Like, really? A machete? That's not very Bond-like. Enemy encounters actually get very difficult and tedious toward the end of the game, and I found that this was the easiest way to cut through. You'd think that Q's gadgets would be just an excellent fit for a Zelda clone, but unfortunately the potential is mostly squandered. New items don't open up the gameplay in any meaningful ways. An electrified keychain is automatically used once in a very specific situation. The laser watch is only useful on a couple of doors, and that's it. There's simply just not much you can do with the majority of your inventory. Bond eventually ends up in Russia, a throwback to the series' Cold War era. By this point in my replay, I started to find the game to be so frustrating that I actually had to visit the old Nintendo Power Shelf and whip out issue 105. The later stages just devolved into thoughtless, enemy-filled mazes. Bond finally encounters the Metal Gear riding mastermind behind the arms cartel, General Golgov, not to be confused with General Gogol of the films. After stopping Golgov's missile launch, Bond takes villain-turned ally Zhang Mei on a slow boat to China. Despite a promising first half that does a good job of turning the information and mystery-solving aspects of Bond into a simplified Game Boy format, the frustrating second half of the game relies on obtuse mazes and far too much combat for a game that really isn't designed for it. But it's those good parts that I mostly remembered from my initial playthrough almost 18 years ago. Sadly, I can't say that it's an unexpected Game Boy gem like I wish I could've, but it certainly does show great potential. I mean, who would have thought? Mixing up Bond and Zelda? I think if someone did it better one day, that might be the best Bond game yet.
From its release in 1989, the Game Boy stormed the market and became the portable gaming unit to have. No longer were you confined to your living room if you wanted to enjoy some good old Nintendo gaming. As the years went on, the Game Boy name would persevere, and we'd see the hardware upgraded and replaced with more powerful options, culminating with the Game Boy Advance in 2001. In 2006, Nintendo would license the Game Boy Advance hardware to a US-based company called Visteon, who specialized in automobile entertainment technology. This partnership would result in a portable DVD player that featured the ability to play GBA games, the Visteon Dockable Entertainment System, featuring Game Boy Advance. At the Winter Consumer Electronics Show in 2006, Visteon Corp would announce their partnership with Nintendo to integrate Game Boy Advance hardware into their line of portable DVD players. While this wasn't exactly an uncommon occurrence for Nintendo, this would mark the first time they'd allow someone else to use their tech in a portable device. Up to this point, we'd only seen things like the LodgeNet N64, which was special hardware used to play Nintendo 64 games in hotel rooms. After a small delay, the Visteon Dockable Entertainment System, featuring Game Boy Advance, or as I like to call it, the Visteon, would see release in July of 2006. Right off the bat, this device had a number of challenges stacked against it. First, it was only available to purchase through a couple of different car manufacturers, such as BMW and Nissan. On top of that, it'd run you over $1,200. It's important to realize that by the time this device was announced, the Nintendo DS was already a year and a half into its life cycle. By the time it was released, the DS Lite was already available in most countries. The Dockable Entertainment System looks like your standard portable DVD player that was fairly common in the mid-2000s. A clamshell design, sleek silver exterior, and an LCD screen. I don't know if it's just me, but all these things tended to look exactly the same. On the right rear side of the screen, you'll find a cartridge slot along with an input for connecting a link cable for some two-player action. If you're hoping to also play your older Game Boy carts, then you're out of luck. Game Boy and Game Boy Colors won't even fit in the slot. Turn on the unit, hit the input aux button, and whatever Game Boy game you have inserted will boot right away. The built-in screen has 3 levels of brightness, which can only be increased using the included DVD remote control. The games retain their 3:2 aspect ratio, but leave a bit of the screen empty. More on that in a minute. Included with the device is this bad boy. Yeah, I guess this controller looks like kind of a mess, but it's actually fairly usable. It uses an infrared signal to connect wirelessly to the Visteon, so it has to be fairly in line with at least one of the 3 IR receivers on the unit. It's definitely easy to lose the signal, but then again, this thing wasn't exactly designed for living room play. The D-pad on this controller was clearly inspired by the original Duke Xbox controller, but not quite as extreme. The button layout is actually pretty neat too. It has your general A and B buttons arranged like they are on a Game Boy Advance, while below you have a giant GameCube controller style A button. This allows for thumb rocking between the buttons like you'd get with, say, an SNES controller going between Y and B. It works great. On the back side, you have your L and R buttons, and these things are pretty much the worst. Because they're so low on the controller, they can be hard for any adult to reach without contorting your hand weirdly. But, to be fair, the L and R buttons were really only easy to use on the first GBA model anyways. The Visteon does house real Game Boy Advance hardware, and as a result, it plays almost exactly like you'd expect from using Nintendo's own Game Boy player with a GameCube on your HD TV. But the big question on your mind is, how do these games look? Well, long story short, don't expect this to be some super secret best way to play your Game Boy Advance games. The GBA's 240 by 160 resolution is scaled up a bit, but it's blurry and doesn't come close to filling the screen. It's a shame that there's no option to scale further, since the screen's 800 by 480 resolution could have allowed for a perfect 3x scale. So what we're left with is a lot of unused screen real estate. The screen quality itself isn't too bad, with just a little bit of ghosting. If you want to fill the screen just a bit more, hitting the screen button on the unit will stretch the image horizontally. Sure, this butchers the game's intended look, but I'm surprised they didn't take it even further because the DVD mode offers a number of video calibration settings and multiple zoom options. Unlike Nintendo's own Game Boy player, there's no options for borders around the image. Now, I've never been a big fan of that kind of thing, but it's surprising because this unit's target audience would probably be annoyed by the amount of unused space. But that's not all. On the side of the unit is a 3.5mm jack that can output both composite and S-video, so you can hook the dockable entertainment system up to the TV for some big screen action. An optional video output cable was sold by Visteon, but the unit that we borrowed didn't include one, so I had to find a workaround for it. Using a variety of cables, I was able to make it work. Connected to a TV, the Visteon only outputs an interlaced signal, which is about what I expected. Without any sort of component video cables available, 480p is impossible, and I guess 240p was too much to wish for. Right away, you'll see the telltale signs of composite video. The rainbowing and dot crawl all over the screen are typical issues with this low-quality video signal on HD TVs, although it's possible that the issues were worsened due to my custom cabling situation. Hooking up S-Video gets you an immediate improvement. I've always felt that the jump from composite to S-Video was pretty huge in terms of video quality, and that's pretty apparent here. The rainbowing is gone and the dot crawl is at a minimum. This looks surprisingly good, if a bit blurry. Comparing the Visteon's output of composite and S-Video to a Game Boy player using a set of the expensive GameCube component cables and Nintendo's official software yields some interesting results. The GBP is obviously a bit crisper and displays a progressive image, but it's so much darker. I have to admit, this isn't quite the decisive victory I originally thought it was going to be. Connecting the Visteon to a CRT television reveals a much more appropriate experience. The interlaced image looks really good, with even composite-looking worlds better. Of course, S-Video is superior, but it can be tough to find a CRT with S-Video on it these days. Since I had it set up, I took a look at how fast the built-in screen really is by comparing it to a CRT. As you can see, there isn't a whole lot of lag between the output and the built-in screen either. What's impressive is that the Game Boy Advance's 3:2 aspect ratio is preserved with video output, unlike some other alternatives like the Super Retro Advance adapter for SNES. Regardless, the Visteon is in no way the best way to play your GBA games on your TV. Homebrew applications like the Game Boy interface for the GameCube Game Boy player offer vastly superior experiences by displaying GBA games at a more fitting resolution of 240p and displaying excellent colors. If you're curious about the Game Boy interface and a bunch of other options for playing these games on your TV, then check out RGB 208 of our RGB Masterclass here on My Life in Gaming. So, okay, yeah, this is all above and beyond what this unit was originally designed for. You're supposed to take it on a trip, play it in your car, and then when you got to your destination, you take it out and plug it into your main TV. So what about the whole portable aspect of this thing? You know, the dockable part of the dockable entertainment system? This dock was made to be mounted to the roof of your vehicle. Once you lock the Visteon into this thing, it will cause the image on the screen to flip over. Since I don't have a car that this will fit in, let's just pretend and flip this thing over. That works, right? The dock doesn't really offer too many benefits, although it does have a composite input so that you can hook other consoles into it as well. Doing so with an older game console, like the SNES, yields some actually decent results, if you don't mind having the image stretched. You cannot make the screen show what resolution it's displaying, but look at that. It's not interlacing progressive content at all. LCD TVs generally tend to read the 240p resolution of older game consoles as 480i, causing some really nasty side effects. It handles the 240p test suite's drop shadow test like a champ. But it's just too bad that this has to be, upside down to use this feature. The Visteon also included a nice pair of wireless headphones that can be used when it's docked. They're not exactly the most comfortable things ever, but they do sound pretty good, and they can get pretty loud. Finally, when docked, you'll of course be able to charge the battery. The dock feeds off the power of the vehicle, but if you wanted to charge it outside of the dock, then you might run into some issues. Like the video output cable, Visteon also sold a proprietary AC adapter for charging outside of the dock, separately. This adapter tends to be pretty difficult to find these days, but you can engineer your own by using a generic 12-volt, 3000 mAh power block and a PSP-sized connector. Strip off the input end of the power block and connect it to the input. And there you go, a totally portable Game Boy Advance. We want to thank Ross Attack on Twitter for allowing us to take a look at his Visteon dockable entertainment system for this video. It's an obscure bit of Game Boy history, and we're glad that we were able to showcase it. The Visteon tends to be pretty rare and expensive these days, which makes sense since there were limited ways to purchase it in the first place. While it offers no real advantages over the multiple ways to play your GBA games, it is a pretty neat footnote to its legacy.
In 2017, boutique retro console maker Analogue released the NT Mini, an NES and Famicom alternative that uses modern technology and smart engineering in a way that makes it fundamentally different from software emulators and traditional clone consoles. Now in 2018, we've got our hands on the next logical step, the Super NT, which, despite being much more powerful, comes in at less than half the cost of the NT Mini. Analogue was confident enough to let us spend a month and a half putting the final hardware through its paces, providing us with all variations for review. And we even had a chance to go behind the scenes with FPGA engineer Kevin Horton.
Absolute cycle accuracy. Everything happens in real time. All the timing, latencies, it's as close as you can get to original hardware on something modern. Back in the early 90s, I was hoping someone would come up with a chip like an FPGA.
It started with the Commodore 64. At a time when information about programming and computer hardware was hard to come by, Kevin Horton, known online as Kevtris, got his start with projects like building his own EEPROM programmer and turning an old printer into a vector plotter.
I always really liked the Commodore 64 music, and I was thinking of ways to kind of generate it or save it.
This idea led Kevtris to create many devices that could play back game music in a hardware-accurate fashion, but mostly for his own enjoyment. This is where FPGAs come in. An FPGA is a digital integrated circuit that is fully customizable, capable of being written and rewritten into whatever configuration is needed, and then installed into a mass-produced circuit board. The decreasing cost of FPGAs in recent years has now made it possible for Kevtris to distribute his work without the need to build complex devices made up of countless components. The FPGA itself can even work as the sum of the parts of a pre-existing hardware configuration, such as a game console, and potentially add features on top of that.
I wanted to develop an FPGA video game system 10 years ago, but no one was gonna pay, That was my big problem, is up until now, nobody's really wanted to pay the price for a system.
With the emergence of systems like the AVS by Retro USB, this sort of hardware has finally become accessible to the broader retro gaming community. Analogue sought out Kevtris' experience for their own FPGA-based NES and Famicom console, the NT Mini, The end result was actually the long-awaited implementation of NES FPGA work that Keptris had completed years earlier.
I pretty much finished it in about 2005 or 6, so it's pretty much what was done back then. That NSF player, that was put in way back then, so I'm happy that finally got released, so people can actually use that, because that was an internal thing for me only.
As the original systems age and become more difficult to maintain over the coming decades, many feel that FPGAs could be the future of preserving classic games in a hardware-accurate environment. For now, we'll just have to see where this path leads. While no one can be certain that Keptris' work is 100% faithful to the originals, his attention to detail cannot be doubted. The NT Mini, for example, replicates every component of the NES, all the way down to the exact pattern of its messy composite output, if that's how you actually want to play it. While incredible things have been done in the world of software emulation, only a hardware solution like an FPGA can interact with a cartridge at the same pace as original hardware.
You can do cycle accurate, but you can't do the same type of latency. Usually on an emulator, everything's processed in batches. The problem is you have to read the cartridge periodically, pretty much. You can't bulk read memory because it's too slow. The ROM is only going to give you the data at that rate.
Everyone assumed that Analogue's next system would be an FPGA with a Super Nintendo core, or at least that's what they were hoping for. Given the huge jump in complexity from the NES to SNES, Keptris thought he couldn't deliver a finished product within Analogue's desired timetable. But he surprised even himself and developed a fully functioning SNES core in only 6 months.
You break it down into the smallest parts possible, and then you work on each part one at a time.
To identify issues with each piece he reverse engineered, Keptris paired up his FPGA versions with original SNES chips on test boards. If something wasn't working right, he knew exactly which piece needed more work.
The PPU was a pushover. I was kind of disappointed, actually.
As with most game consoles, SNES systems can be quite different on the inside, even if they look similar on the outside. Around 1995, Nintendo made sweeping changes to how the SNES console would be manufactured going forward. Because they consolidated CPU and PPU functions into a single chip, these boards are labeled one chip. They're highly coveted in the retro gaming community for their significantly sharper video output compared to earlier systems. However, there are some trade-offs, namely overblown video levels and minor glitches that show up in a small handful of titles. They may be Super Nintendos, but some consider them to be official clone consoles. The Super NT then, being based on the earlier chip design, is almost a paradox. Some might argue that it's more of a true SNES than some of Nintendo's own machines.
It's based on a 213 model, which is a Rev 2 CPU, Rev 1 PPU1, and a Rev 3 PPU2, which is by far the most common.
Ironically, Super Turrican, the director's cut being one of 2 Factor 5 games included with the Super NT, is known for severe sound glitches on one-chip consoles. Flash cards like the Super EverDrive and Super UFO are supported. There has been a lot of discussion recently about poorly designed flash cards or reproduction cards and whether they could damage your consoles, but Keptris isn't worried.
Oh, it won't hurt the Super NT.
Even the MSU1 chip in the popular ST to SNES works, which allows for streaming audio and other impressive feats.
I couldn't believe it worked. It does.
In fact, Keptris didn't have to do anything special to get unusual cartridges to interface with the Super NT.
I have the Sufami Turbo, that works. The Game Saver Plus worked, Dr. SF6 worked. Basically anything I plugged in there's worked. I've tested all the expansion chips. I actually bought all those cartridges off of eBay to test those.
Speaking of cartridges, the NES slot on the NT Mini was exceedingly temperamental, at least on our unit, but the Super NT has given us absolutely no trouble with any cartridge that was at least passably clean. We did report a few issues during our own pre-release testing. The most difficult issues that Keptris ran into during development involved games using direct memory access, or DMA functions, in ways that are fundamentally broken, but ended up working anyway.
My DMA was too good. So I had to, so I'd play a game and, something wouldn't be right, and then I'd have to look through and figure out why, and come to find out most of the time it was because the game did something with the DMA that it wasn't supposed to do.
Thankfully, Keptris was able to address these problems well before the Super NT hardware was in our hands. He has also fixed the scant few visual and audio glitches that we discovered. with the one exception being some curious behavior with the high-res mode in Japanese exclusive Marvelous, but he now has the cartridge and is on the case. We checked several other games that use the SNES high-res graphics and did not encounter any similar issues. As the Super NT is tested by thousands of other SNES fans, it could still take a bit of time before bugs are squashed as thoroughly as with high-end software emulators, like Higan, which have the advantage of having been around for many years. But based on what we've seen, virtually every game already seems to work exactly like you'd hope.
It's going to be very, very minor stuff. I did a fairly extensive testing, days and days running all the games.
Eliminating lag in every aspect of the system was one of the key goals of the Super NT as well as the NT Mini.
The input latency is identical to original systems because the controllers are read in the same way. So there's zero latency there. There's no USB overhead, for example. There's no operating system overhead. And then the video rendering is all in real time. So with the zero lag mode, everything is all in sync with the video generation, so there's no lag.
Of course, one big difference between the NT Mini and the Super NT is the newer system is HDMI only.
The cost of adding analog was just, too much. You'd have to have a DAC and then the connectors, and it would make the system bigger too.
However, thanks to the fact that there's no delay between the render and the HDMI port, Analogue has a unique opportunity to turn, analog output into an external option instead. Analogue is planning to release an adapter that takes a proprietary signal from the HDMI ports of their own consoles and turn it into the same quality of 240p analog signal that the NT Mini's built-in port provides, which is good news for light gun fans.
The Super Scope would work on that.
Honestly, we can't argue against the decision to provide Analogue as an external option, because the best thing about the Super NT is that they managed to squeeze it down to just under $200, well under half of the NT Mini's $450. Yeah, that's not exactly peanuts, but it also means that a lot more people can get their hands on it. And if FPGAs really are to become a revolution in how retro games are played, then price and accessibility must be top priorities.
The Super NT has a bigger FPGA and more RAM than the NT Mini, which makes possible many features that we felt were missing from its predecessor. If you're not a fan of the newfangled font, choose alternate font in the system menu for a more traditional sort of retro text. You can also change menu animations, LED behavior, and more. You can choose between NTSC and PAL in the hardware menu. PAL cartridges may refuse to load if the system is set to NTSC, but interestingly, once it's booted, you can switch regions, which adjusts the speed in real time, so you can run PAL carts at a smooth 60 Hz. However, don't get too excited, because if gameplay was adjusted for a PAL version, then it will play too fast in NTSC mode, and likewise NTSC carts will play too slow in PAL mode. But you may be able to use NTSC mode to run certain unoptimized PAL versions in a manner similar to their NTSC counterparts. But more to the point, let's dig into video settings. Resolution options run the expected gamut of 480p through 1080p.
4K really isn't doable right now. There's no chips that support it. It's too many pixels per second.
Thankfully, so long as your 4K TV does a good job of upscaling 1080p or 720p, the results are still quite good. In fact, you may want to choose 720p over 1080p, specifically if you're a fan of the scanline look. As is the case with many retro upscaling techniques, the Super NT's scanline thickness looks a bit more authentic in 720p, and the softness feels more CRT-like. The Gamma Boost is a nice new feature that we had specifically wished was in the NT Mini. This helps compensate for the darkened image when using the scanlines feature. Be sure to set a vertical integer scale, or else the scanline spacing will be screwed up. You can adjust this in the screen size menu, which offers some basic height and aspect ratio presets, although at this time we feel the list needs some tweaks and additional options that we've suggested and hope might be implemented. The good news is that there is a way to scale the image however you like, independent of the screen size menu, but before we get into that, we have to talk about integer scaling and interpolation. In some ways, integer scaling is not as crucial for the Super NT as it is for similar systems, including the NT Mini. The simplest way to upscale low-res graphics is to use hard-edged lines. This is fine when each axis is scaled by an integer like 4x and 5x, but to get the correct aspect ratio, you would need a non-integer scale. Due to uneven pixel sizing, this can cause shimmering as the screen scrolls, as demonstrated here by the NES Classic Edition. Thankfully, Nintendo themselves fixed this with the Super Nintendo Classic Edition by adding interpolation to the horizontal axis, which results in smooth scrolling at the correct aspect ratio. And the Super NT's upgraded FPGA allowed Kevtris to implement his own version.
The scaler in there, I spent about a month and a half developing it. So it's kind of like a FrameMeister and more.
In short, interpolation calculates missing states between defined values. The end result in this case is that the horizontal and vertical axes are interpolated so that instead of varying pixel sizes, each line has just a slightly soft edge so that all rows and columns appear uniform. This means that you can use, say, 4.5x vertical sizing with the correct 4:3 aspect ratio and get absolutely no shimmering. Kevtris tells us that interpolation was for him a high priority feature, and by our estimation the implementation is very high quality, making it, we feel, the most important graphical feature of the Super NT, and one that we hope to see on all of Analogue and Kevtris' work going forward. You can, by the way, disable interpolation in the scaler menu. When we first received the Super NT, it was a single toggle for both axes, but they implemented a bit of our feedback, and the firmware available at launch has separate toggles for horizontal and vertical interpolation. At 1080p, disabling vertical interpolation has almost no perceptible effect, but at 720p as well as 480p, it is quite nice to disable only vertical interpolation to get sharp-edged lines while still enjoying shimmer-free scrolling. Since most footage in this episode was recorded at 1080p, we decided to leave interpolation enabled for both horizontal and vertical axes so that we could take full advantage of the system's advanced scaling features, which you can access by activating the advanced mode toggle, which brings us even more fun and excitement. Alongside multiple extra options, screen size is replaced by width and height. Since we left interpolation on, there's no reason for us to not fill the screen however we like. Here are the settings we dialed in, which completely fills the vertical 1080p space in games with no letterboxes, perfectly centers every game we tested, and the aspect ratio is based on my PVM 20L5. If you want to turn off interpolation for a sharper image and use integer scales instead, we recommend a height of 1200 and a width of 1536, or a height of 960 with a width of 1280. The extra features menu has a few toggles that make minor alterations to SNES rendering behavior to improve visuals in specific situations. The most interesting is pseudo high-res blending. Sometimes the SNES 512 pixel wide mode might be used as a striped pattern on an overlapping layer. On a consumer-grade CRT, this might blend to look like a sort of transparency, but the Super NT can turn it into true transparency, which works great in Kirby's Dream Land 3. None of the features of the Super NT do anything like reduce slowdown. For better or worse, slowdown appears to occur in just the same way as a real SNES. Right after interpolation, we'd say that the most exciting new feature to the Super NT that the NT Mini could not have are buffer options. By default, zero delay is enabled. What this means is that there is absolutely no delay on the HDMI output. Everything is rendered and output in real time, so if you have a low lag TV or monitor, then you can get a nearly CRT-like experience. But there is a quirk to the zero delay mode that is also shared by the NT Mini and High Def NES. The NES and SNES both run at a speed a bit over 60 Hz. The OSSC reads it as 60.08 Hz, which isn't a problem at all in the analog realm. But to ensure maximum compatibility with digital displays, the Super NT actually runs a bit downclocked so that it can hit an even 60 Hz. it's not something that any human being is likely to actually perceive. I mean, over the course of 10 minutes, the Super NT loses only about 1 second, but it is a small thing that makes it just the teensiest touch removed from original hardware.
Well, there's a frame buffer now. So a frame buffer gives me a lot more options.
By choosing fully buffered, the Super NT runs at the SNES's original slightly faster than 60 Hz speed, while still outputting an even 60 Hz. There are two small trade-offs. First, a bit of lag that is never more than 1 frame.
It varies from 0 to 16 milliseconds and wraps. It's a sawtooth.
Second, a frame must be dropped approximately every 10 seconds to stay matched up to the 60 Hz output. An alternative is single buffer, which is supposed to be less lag, but rather than dropping a frame causes a screen tear to roll up the screen about every 10 seconds instead. Audio options are pretty simple. If you're using a cartridge with analog audio pass-through, then you need to activate the analog to digital converter manually. To our knowledge, this is only relevant for 2 types of cartridges: the previously mentioned SD2 with its MSU1 chip, and the Super Game Boy. The Super Game Boy itself is responsible for the game's audio processing, which is passed through the cartridge as analog. If the cartridge audio were not activated, then you'd only hear sounds that are processed by the SNES. With cartridge audio activated, you may hear a fair bit of noise, most noticeable on silent screens.
You're hearing the CPU bus noise on the Super Game Boy is what you're hearing. You can hear it on a regular Game Boy if you have headphones and turn it up, you can hear it too.
It is much harder to hear this noise when playing with analog output on a real SNES, but if you balance the cartridge audio with your sound system volume, you can hopefully find a satisfactory balance between audible game sound and low noise levels. It's really fascinating to consider the Super Game Boy when it comes to the Super NT, seeing as how it's real Game Boy hardware in a cartridge. Whether you play through an SNES or a Super NT, you're still playing a true Game Boy. To get the correct sizing for Game Boy games, you should set the Super NT to a square pixel aspect ratio like 5x vertical and 5x horizontal, something that's actually a bit easier to achieve here compared to analog output from a real SNES. But as you may know, there are some drawbacks to the Super Game Boy in terms of accuracy. It was designed to use a crystal oscillator to run at a Game Boy's true speed, but to save cost, the final product derives its speed from the SNES system clock instead. The result is that Game Boy games run faster than intended, and you may notice frequent stutters as the screen scrolls. However, the Japan-exclusive Super Game Boy 2 greatly alleviates these problems by including the crystal oscillator to not only run the Game Boy hardware at the correct speed, but also reduce stuttering significantly. This is interesting for the Super NT for 2 reasons. First, while the original Super Game Boy is controlled by the cartridge bus in the Super NT, just as with a real SNES, in this case losing just a bit of speed in the zero lag mode, but not much, Super Game Boy 2 speed is completely unaffected by the Super NT system, making it a totally accurate original Game Boy hardware solution. Second, the Super Game Boy 2 stutters even less when played in the Super NT's zero lag mode. There is still a frame hitch every several seconds. Game Boy speed just doesn't quite sync up to 60 Hz, but our tests show that it is less frequent than on a real SNES. Regardless of your feelings over whether an FPGA is as valid as original hardware, this still qualifies as a true Game Boy hardware setup that, in this case, performs just a bit better via the Super NT and at the correct speed. We can't help but wish that maybe in the future we could see the ability to scale up to 7x for Game Boy games, or perhaps even some Super Game Boy optimized modes to eliminate stutter altogether. It feels like there's potential here to make the ultimate interface for playing pre-Game Boy Color titles with real hardware on your TV, if Analogue and Kevtris wanted to make it happen.
Of of course, the Super NT has only just been released, so we're hopeful that its features will be refined and expanded upon as time goes on.
Oh yeah, there's plenty of extra space on that FPGA, which is nice. So on the NT Mini, I ran out of space.
The Super Famicom was released nearly 30 years ago, more than ancient in computing terms. It may have some of the most revered and polished 2D games ever made, but you have to wonder if the guy who finished reverse engineering it even likes it.
It's really awesome hardware, I think. I mean, they did a very, very good job of it. You know, I can't easily go back to NES so much anymore. So, no, I think this is about the peak for a 2D system. I would say it would be the peak.
But does it have blast processing?
The CPU bus is 8 bits. You know, on the Genesis, it's 16 bits. But, you know, it can execute memory reads and writes every single cycle. In the Genesis, it takes 8 cycles to do it.
The SNES does have 16-bit video if you consider that 2 8-bit VRAMs work in parallel. But just how far can we take FPGA gaming hardware?
PlayStation 1, Neo Geo, that would be about it.
One of the systems that seems to be on everyone's mind, the N64, with fantasies of hardware-accurate FPGA consoles that might even render at a higher resolution or with better frame rates. But even if an FPGA were powerful enough to do it one day, you might not want to hold your breath.
It would be very difficult, I think. The problem is the complexity, you know, goes up a lot, much more complicated.
In the right hands, FPGA-based game consoles offer perhaps the most exciting alternatives to the real thing, while offering modern conveniences. But no matter how archaic a system may be, Keptris remains doggedly committed to accuracy.
I replicate hardware behavior. I don't try to ask why it does it. I just say this is how it does it.
Keptris was mum on whether he might see a return of his personal jailbreak firmware that he released for the NT Mini, which made it possible to load ROMs and other 8-bit cores that he had already developed. Definitely a significant added value. Regardless of whether an unofficial feature like that materializes for the Super NT, we're already impressed with Analogue's new direction, and hope that this trend continues through feature hardware. Compact, portable, great mechanical feel to the cartridge slot and controller ports, and optional analog support. The Super NT feels like a collection of smart ideas and small tweaks that add up to a more sensible and affordable piece of tech. So all we want to know now is, what's next?
Resident Evil.
Resident Evil has got to be one of my top 5 favorite video game series. But during the 90s, Resident Evil games were something that I watched friends play, thinking I wouldn't enjoy them myself. It wasn't until the GameCube remake of the original Resident Evil, arguably the best remake in gaming history, that I started to really get into the series. This remake has since had an excellent HD remake of its own. But did you know that the original Resident Evil, the basis for the remake, was, supposedly during early development, itself intended to be a remake of sorts of another Capcom game, which was a video game adaptation of a 1989 Japanese horror film. This is Sweet Home, the 8-bit forerunner of the survival horror genre and the inspiration for Resident Evil. In January 1989, Sweet Home was released to theaters in Japan. In the years since, it's fallen into obscurity with, as far as I can tell, no official DVD release, and tracking down a legitimate VHS available for import is nearly impossible. The film follows a documentary crew into the dilapidated mansion of the late Ichiro Mamiya, a famous fresco artist whose work they aim to preserve and share with the world. But the crew is soon tormented by the violent ghost of Mamiya's wife, who went insane before her death over the loss of their son. It's certainly not a bad movie, but director Kiyoshi Kurosawa is said to have disowned it over meddling by the producer Juzo Itami. Itami also produced a video game called Sweet Home with Capcom. Concrete information on its development is hard to come by, and it's difficult to say whether Sweet Home the video game was conceived as an adaptation of the film or alongside the film as part of a multimedia project. Directed by Capcom's Tokuro Fujiwara, creator of Ghosts and Goblins and Bionic Commando, Sweet Home creates its own identity, using the plot points of the film as only a very loose basis. It was released on the Famicom in December 1989. Likely due to its gruesome subject matter that Nintendo of America wouldn't have allowed during the NES days, Sweet Home never left Japan. Thankfully, it has a fully playable fan translation released by Gaijin Productions in 2000, which makes it popular as a reproduction cartridge. I played the fan translation via my Japanese Famicom cartridge on the Retron 5. The main cast is the same as the film, and each has a special tool which, well, some are accurate to the film and others are a bit of a stretch. Producer Kazuo has a lighter, Akiko is portrayed as a nurse with a medical kit, cameraman Taguchi has a camera, art restoration specialist Asuka has a vacuum cleaner, and Kazuo's daughter Imi carries around a key that unlocks many of the mansion's doors. Wait a minute. Isn't this like... Whoa! Whoa! In the original Resident Evil, Chris Redfield has a lighter, Jill Valentine is the master of unlocking, and Rebecca Chambers is a medic. Whoa! So what do we do with these last two? Well, what if the cast of Sweet Home actually inspired more than just Capcom's games? Everyone thinks of Ghostbusters when they see Luigi's Mansion, but what if the vacuum cleaner actually came from Sweet Home? And the camera? Let's say Fatal Frame? The default names are kinda hard for me to keep track of, so how about this? Chris, Becca, Mio, Luigi, and Jill. Love it. Pretty sure we swapped up a few genders there, but whatever. All right, let's get whoa! Why is everything spinning? Oh, wait, okay. So the screen doesn't actually turn upside down, but Sweet Home does have an unusual take on the top-down perspective, with the sprites rotating based on which direction they're moving. I've never seen another game do this, but I got used to it easily enough. Unlike Resident Evil, Sweet Home is actually a straight-up JRPG, Capcom's first. Though the interface takes some getting used to, the 5 characters can build parties of up to 3. What makes this interesting is that you can never have 2 perfect and balanced parties. There's always going to be at least one group that you're a bit nervous to send wandering about the mansion. Let's call Chris, Jill, and Becca Team Resident Evil, and art preservation experts Mio and Luigi Team Fresco. You can switch characters at any time, and anyone can be moved anywhere in the mansion, either individually or as a group. But don't wander too aimlessly because, oh no. Oh geez. Oh geez. Oh geez. Ah! That battle intro just gets me. Listen. I just love how it builds the tension and feeds the uncertainty that almost any encounter could be against the most horrible creature. So yes, it's random encounters for the most part, and super basic battle mechanics. The lack of a defend function is annoying, but the most interesting thing is that other characters or groups can be called for help. If they aren't too far away, you can move them over to join the fight. Pretty cool. But fighting monsters isn't to be taken lightly. They can deal heavy damage, cause horribly debilitating status effects, which cause dire emergencies that only Becca can cure. And HP healing tonics are a limited resource. You can only use what you find, but they do fully heal everyone in a party. While they aren't exceedingly rare, you do have to manage HP very differently from your typical JRPG. Though I do have to admit, once I got just a bit past the leveling curve, about halfway through the game, battles got kinda easy. But you will get into other life-threatening situations than just losing HP in battle. Characters can sink into toxic goop, or fall when crossing rickety boards. Oh, hang in there, Luigi! If no one can save them in time, well, they're dead. That's right, I'm talking about permadeath. Dang it, Luigi, get it together! If a character does die, you can find items to replace their essential character-specific tools. Much like Resident Evil, inventory space is very limited, and item management is a highlight of the gameplay. Each character can only hold one weapon and 2 items in addition to their special tool. It's always a tough choice to take a newly discovered item, leaving in its place something else that you never know if you'll need later. While I'm not completely convinced on the authenticity of sources saying that Resident Evil began as a remake of Sweet Home, rather than simply a spiritual successor, large parts of Resident Evil are undeniably faithful to its Sweet Home foundation. Like the famous door animations, which cleverly hide load times, well, they were on the Famicom too, clearly not hiding load times. Also, much of the story is revealed through documents scattered throughout the mansion. I particularly like this one, which speaks of this place as a house of residing evil! Whoa! I'm sure it's just a bit of fun on the part of the fan translators, but I gotta wonder, what if the original Japanese was warning you about biological hazards? A few puzzles are pretty confusing, with hints about where to go and what to do being vaguely worded at times. The last bit of the game in particular devolved into scouring the entire mansion for items behind previously inaccessible rooms. Wish I'd taken notes. Upon finishing the game, which took me about 12 hours, you'll see a different ending depending on how many characters made it out of the mansion alive. Not only was Sweet Home way ahead of its time, but it's still entertaining to this day. It's a fascinating look at a rare example of a movie-inspired game having a much bigger impact than its source material, even though it is itself somewhat obscure due to its Japanese exclusivity. But no matter how you look at it, there's no doubt that the survival horror genre owes a lot to this old Famicom adventure starring Chris, Jill, Becca, Mio, and Luigi. I've had lots of favorite games over the years, but sometimes I've questioned what my favorites really are. It's still fun to think about, but in recent years I've come to the conclusion that it's just too tough to pick favorites, and I've mostly given up on having easy answers for them. But if my life somehow depended on picking one favorite game of all time, I've decided that it's got to be Super Mario Bros. 3. And why do I love it so much? I don't know. I just do. I'm not going to pretend that I've got much else to add to the conversation on Mario 3. But I love it so much that I decided I wanted to make it unique among my cart-only NES and Famicom collections. So I bought a complete boxed copy of the North American version, as well as the Japanese version. It's been a long time since I've had a chance to go through the paper materials of a game this old. So let's take a look at these and remember how a classic from the early 90s presented itself. It's a beautiful box, one of the most iconic ever. The text on the back really makes you feel like this could be the biggest and most varied NES adventure imaginable. And maybe it is. But I'm kind of confused why it's hyping me up to go back to that last screen and get a mushroom. Like left and right screen scrolling, maybe? Hardly a noteworthy feature in its time. And hey, look, is this the origin of Nintendo's insistence that maybe I should take a break? Whoa, man, this adventure's so big, you'll never beat it without pausing. I'd love to know more about how boxes were designed back in the day. These screenshots aren't even straight, and they have inconsistent light levels. Oh, and this level doesn't even exist. Now, when I took a look inside the box before buying, I was sold the moment I discovered that not only did it have the manual, but also a little Nintendo Power advertisement and an NES poster. It's interesting to see a few games advertised that are hardly remembered nowadays. I've never really thought that much about the extra inserts that come with a game. But now that we rarely get anything more than ugly DLC slips, if that, well, it kind of makes me appreciate it. We're not going to see new stuff like this ever again. I don't know, it's a little sad. Check it out, they even gave a taste of Nintendo Power's indispensable knowledge by sharing Mario 3's most famous secret. I wonder if my original copy had this insert, because I sure didn't know about any of the warp whistles until at least sometime after I'd had the game. But the manual? Now this is something I remember. This is probably one of the most polished NES manuals out there. It's loaded with colorful artwork and gives a bit of personality to the characters. I like this message from Mario that it starts off with a cool little Tanuki stamp. And here's the Koopa Kids. Now these guys have always been among my favorite characters in the Mario universe, and I can't tell you how happy I am that they've once again become a staple in modern Mario games. It was a long wait. I love their distinctive designs, and they appear throughout the manual with little word bubbles that give a bit of flavor for what's detailed on the page. The Koopa Kids definitely made an impression, and I really do have to applaud Nintendo for doing them justice with their modern iterations. Because frankly, the 8 and 16-bit representations never quite lived up to what my 6-year-old self saw in the manual. Though I suppose we're supposed to call them Koopalings these days, and the text in this old manual is now considered inaccurate, because this twerp is now Bowser's only official child. Oh well. The manual is over 40 pages, maybe not the biggest ever, but it's certainly large for a platformer. It teases a ton of items. Back when Mario 3 was new, I wasn't into adventures like Zelda yet, so the sheer number of things you could collect and use really captured my imagination. But man, I sure don't remember the items looking this bad. It's honestly kind of fascinating to see composite video in print form. Toward the end of the manual, we're introduced to some of Bowser's new minions, or variations on the old bad guys that we hadn't seen before. Man, I've always liked the blue thwomps best. And these things have a name, you know, Rotodiscs, though for the longest time I called them Rotozytics or something like that. This was also the first time ghosts appeared in Mario's world. A lot of people forget that they used to be called not just Boo, but Boo Diddley, an homage to a musician, just like the Koopa Kids, though I certainly didn't know it at the time. And at the end of the manual, we get a nice little note from the Mario 3 staff, supposedly anyway. While the packaging for the North American version goes for a bold and minimalist approach, the Famicom box is overloaded with detail. It's a beautiful image that North American fans have had much fewer opportunities to ever see. It's fun to see Luigi, Toad, and Peach represented. None of them even get a single bit of artwork in the North American manual. I love how the Koopalings are all running and tumbling down this hill from a fortress. And Bowser looks awesome and imposing, but is also decidedly the weirdest part of the image. Black eyebrows? Blue eyes? A flowing cape? Is that an eyeball under his chin? Am I misinterpreting something here? Did they plan another form for Bowser that got cut? Well, he has had black eyebrows before in Japanese artwork, but otherwise it's just so dang strange to see him appear so differently on artwork that is otherwise extremely consistent with everything else. Well, I guess that flying blooper is weird too. Get out of here! Go bother someone in Lost Levels. The Japanese manual has just as many pages as the North American manual, and for the most part presents pretty much the same information, as far as I can tell. Though I'm not familiar with this weird picture of Bowser's legs stomping Mario. I'm told that Bowser is referring to himself in a particularly arrogant tone here, a bit of characterization that's lost in the translation. It's also worth noting that the Koopalings didn't originally have individual names. Those were brought back to Japan after the North American release of Mario 3. The Koopalings' little blurbs also seem to be fairly similar in content, though there are some larger differences. Roy appears on a different page in the Japanese manual, and seems to think Mario is a bit greedy, collecting all of these items to use on the world map. The manual even has a whole page with a really neat watercolor painting that I've not seen represented in exactly this form anywhere else. The US manual really didn't give much attention to airships, which are one of my favorite things in the game. The Japanese manual also has a letter from the game staff, but there's a curious little PS at the bottom. They hint at the existence of warp flutes as a way of apologizing for the lack of battery backup saves. Something that certainly surprises me, because in Western culture you'd never see official materials mention a missing feature, let alone apologize for it. It's been a lot of fun having a chance to look through these materials again, and in some cases a few things I'd never seen before. Ever since games became overly tutorialized, I'll admit that I've barely given most manuals even one glance for a couple of generations now. And I've probably missed a lot of clever presentation and rarely seen artwork. But now that stuff like this is all but gone, I think it's important to preserve what we do have. If you were born in the 80s, then there's a pretty good chance that your first gaming memories were made with the Nintendo Entertainment System. Whether you call it the NES, Original Nintendo, or just Nintendo, there's no denying that this 8-bit machine and its amazing library played one of the biggest roles in evolving video games into an enduring cultural cornerstone. For me, the NES remains perhaps my most played retro console. But it's certainly not without its flaws, chief among them that it can only output composite video at best. And that's not pretty, especially on modern TVs. Nintendo loved to show giant pixelated sprites on the label art for its earlier NES titles. But sadly, the system just can't produce that kind of quality. Well, not normally anyway. Let's take a look at what the NES hardware is really capable of. Welcome to RGB 202.
Nintendo released the Family Computer, better known as the Famicom, in Japan in 1983. A redesigned and rebranded version of the hardware was then released in North America in 1985 as the Nintendo Entertainment System, famously bringing home video games back to popularity following the American video game industry crash of 1983. The NES was also distributed in Europe and other regions using the PAL video standard, where it faced much steeper competition from home computers like the Commodore 64. The NES and Famicom run on microprocessors developed by a Japanese company called Ricoh. The Picture Processing Unit, or PPU, provided the system with a palette of 54 colors, displaying up to 25 colors at once. Most notably, the NES lacks good options for yellow. But the corrections for this, through modification or emulation, don't look all that great. The NES's color limitations are both a weakness as well as an accepted facet of each game's intended look. As for the actual video output, Ricoh's NES PPU is only capable of generating composite video. And as you know by now, that means subpar quality. And as if it needed to be any worse, the original model of the Famicom only has one option for connecting to your TV: a single cable pumping both audio and composite video through an RF modulator. The NES, on the other hand, has an RCA composite video port and a mono RCA audio port on the right-hand side of the system, which produces better quality than RF. However, every NES shipped with an RF modulator, and since televisions at the time commonly had no inputs other than for an RF signal, that's how most people played their NES. When Nintendo released the Model 2, or top-loader NES in 1993, they actually removed the composite video output, leaving RF as the only option. Which is a real shame because the top loader is known for being way more reliable at connecting with game cartridges than the old front loader. The similarly designed Famicom revision, released in Japan around the same time, actually did the reverse. It added the familiar AV multi-out port that's used on the Super Nintendo, N64, and GameCube, giving Japanese Famicom fans an option other than RF for the first time ever. This unit is commonly referred to as the AV Famicom. But don't be fooled into thinking you can just plug any connection beyond composite and get a cleaner video signal. It just doesn't work. S-Video is sadly not an option. Still, if you're interested in Famicom cards, this is absolutely the model to get. For the everyday NES fan, composite video using a standard RCA cable is absolutely the way to go. You can split the mono audio signal into two RCA cables using a Y adapter, like this. They cost something like $5. Using this method, the image is certainly less noisy than RF, but the edges are still pretty rough. If you want something more, let's take a look at how you can push the NES and Famicom's video quality beyond their limits.
If you've watched our RGB 101 video and the rest of the RGB Masterclass series, then you already know about RGB video and how it's so much cleaner and sharper than composite video. You'll also know about the various cables and devices that can be used to receive the signal, like professional video monitors or video scalers like the FrameMeister. A lot of retro consoles that are traditionally hooked up with RF or composite video are actually generating an RGB signal that the composite video is derived from. But when it comes to the NES and Famicom, the onboard Ricoh PPU is generating composite video, and that's that. There's a method around this limitation that modders have performed for some time. Nintendo used to make arcade machines called the Play Choice 10. They feature interchangeable boards that play up to 10 NES games on one machine. And it just so happens that the Play Choice 10 features an RGB picture processing unit also manufactured by Ricoh. If you know what you're doing, you can use it to replace Ricoh's composite video PPU on the NES or Famicom motherboard. So that's pretty neat, but there are some issues. The Play Choice 10 uses a different color palette, so colors won't look quite like they should. There's also the matter of the mod ruining a legacy arcade machine or consuming limited unused replacement parts, as well as being pretty expensive due to availability. Getting better video quality out of the NES has been a pretty tough nut for the modding community to crack. In fact, it's only been in very recent years that a superior solution has been developed. The major breakthrough has been thanks to an Australian modder named Tim Worthington, who developed and sells a custom board that's called the NES RGB. Now remember, we're not modders and don't fully understand its operation. But the gist of it is that the NES RGB doesn't replace the original PPU, but rather works alongside it. If you're into learning how to do the installation yourself, Tim's website has plenty of documentation. He also sells the NES RGB board on his website. Depending on your model of NES or Famicom, you may also need to select a fairly cheap adapter board with your purchase. Tim has distributors in other regions around the world, so it's possible you can hire their modding services like I did, or find another reliable modder to help you out. If you don't already own the NES or Famicom that you'd like to have modified, a more convenient option might be to buy a pre-modded system on eBay by searching for NES RGB. The mod even adds S-Video support to your console, which looks great on my CRT. You can access the RGB signal using a SCART or JP21 cable that's designed for Nintendo consoles. You can then convert to the proper connector for whatever RGB capable device you use. If you're unsure which cable to buy, the NES RGB mod does support C-Sync, which is a pure sync signal that generally provides cleaner picture results than other sync methods. A switch can be installed with the NES RGB mod that allows you to toggle between various color modes. We prefer the default, which is an attempt to accurately recreate the NES palette with RGB color values. If you'd prefer no switch, then you can ask your modder to lock output to a particular palette. So which system is the best candidate for modification? Well, it's your choice really. Corey bought a pre-modded NES top loader, which is a great option for its reliability over the classic front loader. I decided to go for a mod with my AV Famicom because I already had this NES to Famicom cartridge converter, which works perfectly with every North American cart that I've thrown at it, aside from Castlevania 3 and Jackal. A modded Famicom also means that I can play disk system games in RGB, which is pretty neat too. Now here's Corey with a few more interesting considerations.
A partnership between Nintendo and Sharp resulted in 3 very unique systems. First, the very rare Sharp Nintendo television, which has a built-in NES cartridge slot and is said to display a slightly higher quality image, but the Japanese version, the Sharp C1, actually uses an RGB picture processing unit. Second is the Twin Famicom, which supports both Famicom cartridges and Famicom disk system games in a single console. And finally, the Famicom Titler, which actually supports RGB and S-Video, in addition to allowing users to add custom text to the image for the purposes of creating videos. Unfortunately, it's super expensive these days, so it's not really a viable option except for the most dedicated of collectors. There's also the matter of the French NES, which included a SCART cable and has a port labeled RGB, but we're told that the end result is just composite quality video. As hardware patents have expired in recent years, you've probably seen these clone systems like the Retro Duo, which plays NES and Super Nintendo carts. These systems run on hardware similar to the originals, but slight differences can cause compatibility issues in various games. They may also have S-Video ports, which work with Super Nintendo games, but unfortunately, none of these systems support NES through S-Video. The Retron 5 outputs cleaner video because it runs on emulators, rather than cloned hardware. The Analogue NT is different from a clone system in that it's built using processing chips from an actual NES and Famicom console, and then rebuilt into a custom aluminum case. It outputs RGB video, optionally scaled to HD over HDMI, using a custom solution developed by Analogue Interactive. Meanwhile, the Super 8-bit is a similar RGB-capable system, which also uses repurposed chips from the original hardware. There's also been other projects that attempt to work 1080p scaling and HDMI output directly into the console itself. Of course, one of the simplest official methods for playing NES games is through Nintendo's own Virtual Console service. But unfortunately, Nintendo's emulator for NES games fails to impress. On both the Wii and Wii U, the image is noticeably darkened, and pixels are excessively blurred. Check out how the Wii U Virtual Console compares to the NES Composite and NES RGB through the FrameMeister. This treatment of the NES games is even more bizarre due to how much brighter and sharper systems like the Super Nintendo and GBA appear on the Wii U. But much more interestingly, NES Virtual Console on the original Wii hardware can actually output an authentic 240p resolution over component, which is great for scalers and CRTs. It's still not as good as what you can get out of the NES RGB, but think twice before you transfer all of your Virtual Console games to the Wii U.
So that's the Nintendo Entertainment System. If you're looking to play real carts on real hardware, it's unfortunately not the easiest or cheapest console to get great video quality out of. And you know, I guess I can see the argument that fuzzy composite video is just how NES games are supposed to look. I mean, I dealt with it for most of my life and I didn't think any less of the system. But thanks to a creative modding community, if you want razor-sharp pixels generated by real NES hardware, that dream is now available for everyone. When you think of Sunsoft, I'm willing to bet that the first things that come to mind are some of the best tunes on the NES. As was the case for many game companies in the late 90s, Sunsoft paid more attention to Sony's PlayStation than the more business-risky N64. But Sunsoft did publish two interesting games for Nintendo's platform, both from the same series. Let's take a look at Chameleon Twist and Chameleon Twist 2. Sunsoft seems to have actually not had a ton to do with the Chameleon Twist series, simply serving as publisher for the West. In Japan, the games were developed and published by Japan System Supply. Aw, isn't that the best? Aside from the Chameleon Twist series and a Japan-exclusive Game Boy game, it's hard to find much evidence of Japan System Supply's time in the game business. Chameleon Twist was released early on in the N64's life in late '97 and features some pretty interesting ideas. You play as a curious chameleon who follows an Alice in Wonderland type rabbit into a magical land where you're transformed into, well, something that doesn't look very much like a chameleon, that's for sure. I can't decide if he's more of an anthropomorphized billiards ball or Lolo with a body. The default chameleon is Davy, but you can also choose 3 others who play identically. The goal is pretty much just to have a fun adventure. There's no one to save, no villain out to destroy the world. This game is nothing more than a vacation from Davy's everyday chameleon life. But he is still a chameleon, which is the foundation for the game's main twist. Chameleon Twist is a 3D platformer in which your primary tool is a long tongue that you can control with the analog stick. Sure, plenty of games are built around characters that eat their enemies, but the way that Davy and friends use their tongues still feels fairly unique. As you'd expect, any small enemy that comes in contact with Davy's tongue gets eaten. The more enemies you grab with a single slurp, the more shots you can fire with your next attack. What's interesting is that all regular enemies are sprites, so there can be quite a lot of them on screen. By holding Z, you can stand on your tongue and do a high jump. The timing is kind of a bit tricky. For some reason, the camera angles can make it difficult for me to judge when high jumps are required. I died so many times in this room because I thought the platforms were much further apart and higher up than they actually are. The last 2 moves have to do with attaching your tongue to poles in the environment. Once attached, you can do one of 2 things. Simply continue holding B and wait a moment for Davy to pull himself over, or hold A and a direction to rotate. This is a pretty clever mechanic, but is also by far the most awkward move in the game. I like the idea, but it never felt quite right to me. Chameleon Twist was released in the age of 3D platformers, but I think it deserves special recognition for living up to the platformer moniker. The most famous platformers on the N64 aren't really platformers in the traditional sense, if you think about it. While they do have a lot of jumping and plenty of challenge in their own way, games like Banjo-Kazooie and such are really more about exploration and discovering things in the environment. Chameleon Twist, on the other hand, is something of an oddity in its generation for being designed around linear levels and more traditional sorts of platforming challenges. Despite some frustrating moments, Chameleon Twist is overall a super easy game that can be finished in 2 to 3 hours. Checkpoints are extremely frequent, and every checkpoint is forever. Even if you game over, you always continue just a bit behind where you died. The biggest challenge is collecting the optional crowns in every level, many of which are located in very tricky places. There are only 6 levels in the fantasy world: Jungle Land, Ant Land, Bomb Land, Desert Castle, Kids Land, which is mostly all about sweet foods, and I personally take a lot of offense at the implication of delicious sweets being for kids. And lastly, Ghost Castle. The Ant Queen battle deserves special mention for being a bit annoying, but overall the boss fights are pretty fun. Even if it's not perfect and is really short, Chameleon Twist is a good game with good ideas that any N64 fan should give a fair shot. Back in the day, this is what we called a good rental, and that's exactly what Chameleon Twist was to me. Since I finished it so fast back then, it didn't seem worth buying at the time, but I did have fond memories of it and grabbed a copy for cheap in more recent years. Thankfully, it isn't hard to find, but I always tended to forget that there's another game you don't see quite as often and doesn't tend to be priced quite as fairly. But I finally got a copy of Chameleon Twist 2. First things first, yes, you actually transform into something that looks like an anthropomorphic chameleon, and high voltage screaming, what? Okay, so what I think is going on here, you know the whole tactical espionage action thing, right? Well, in Japan, that sort of fake genre is actually very commonly attached to games to make them sound unique, I guess? Somehow it carried over to the title screen in the Western release, but how it actually connects to the game?
High voltage screaming action! Chameleon Twist 2!
Your guess is as good as mine. At any rate, the setup is pretty much exactly the same as before. The rabbit leads your chameleon to a new fantasy world with another 6 stages. In the Western version, Davy is actually now the green chameleon. I guess they were trying to go for something a bit cooler and less abstract, but here's the interesting thing. The Japanese version retains the cuter and weirder original designs, including Davy being the blue one. Honestly, I like both in their own way. The sequel introduces 3 new moves. First up, the chameleon's backpacks now deploy a parachute with the press of the Z button at any time. This is a decent idea, but unfortunately the level design leads to it not being very necessary for most of the game. Second, an obvious addition to the horizontal tongue rotation of the first game is vertical rotation. It's similarly awkward to perform, and the few areas of the game that require it are among the most difficult, at least for me. It's really tough to get the timing and momentum just right, but I have to respect it as good use of a tongue in a platforming game. The last new move is a bit more subtle, but also potentially the most interesting. In the first game, if your tongue hits a wall, you immediately pull it back in. But now, your tongue doesn't only stick to posts and enemies, it attaches to any surface, and you can pull yourself right up to it. I love how this really integrates your main ability with the environment, and it would be a killer move for grappling, platforming, and exploring in almost any game. Unfortunately, again, it's a bit underutilized in Chameleon Twist 2. I'm sure it could lead to some fancy platforming and a speed run, but it's rarely necessary outside of the final level. Speaking of underutilized, Chameleon Twist 2 in many ways feels like it relies on the tongue mechanics a bit less in general when compared to the first game. A lot of times I found myself just doing everyday running and jumping, which is by no means a bad thing, but with the characters making for some unique possibilities, it feels like there are some missed opportunities due to the level design just being pretty average. It might not sound like it, but despite these misfires, Chameleon Twist 2 feels in some ways slightly more polished than the first game. It's a solid platformer and moves along at a bit of a quicker pace than the original, generally favoring level design that keeps the action moving. It's also got a pretty good set of bosses, like a walrus on spiked wheels, which is pretty rad, and he's fairly challenging, as are some of the other bosses like this giant toy robot. Chameleon Twist 2 also features as a boss one of the best looking hamburgers I've ever seen in a video game. Despite some tough moments, Chameleon Twist 2 took me about 3 hours to play through. Both games are short and mostly easy, but also full of good ideas and overall decent design. In addition to being Sunsoft's only involvement with the N64, these games are also the biggest mark that Japan System Supply and their adorable animated cat logo left on the gaming world. And while back in the day, these games may have not been much more than a good rental, and they certainly don't have any high voltage screaming action, I think looking at them now, they stand out as enjoyable and unique examples of more traditional platforming sensibilities brought into the realm of early 3D gameplay. It's been a year since NES games finally came to the Nintendo Switch, and now we've got Super Nintendo games, so let's take a look at how they compare to previous releases and other ways to play these games. So our previous MLiG Mini casual conversation style of video went over actually pretty well. And so we're going to continue to sort of sprinkle these in between our proper, fully scripted episodes. And today we're talking about the Super Nintendo games on the Nintendo Switch through the Nintendo Online Services subscription.
This is something that a lot of people wanted us to take a look at. We weren't thinking that we were going to at first because it's very similar to the previous release. The interface is almost exactly the same. I mean, the menu, it's this big checkerboard of boxes all spread out, and all the options are basically identical to the NES.
But it is worth pointing out that some features have been patched in the intervening year. So that annoying button prompt information that would appear on the screen at all times, you can turn that off in the settings now on the NES as well as the Super Nintendo.
Thank God.
But unfortunately, some of the flaws remain, like you've still got the border at all times, that gray gradient border, which is granted not the most obnoxious border ever, but I still wish it could just be pure black, and it is always going to display your player icon in the upper left, also kind of annoying, but I will say that I have not seen any image retention even after several hours of play on my OLED, so I'm not too concerned about it. I just don't like looking at it. And one other nice thing that was fixed on the NES app that also carries over to the Super Nintendo app, the CRT filter mode doesn't have this sort of rapidly flickering noise effect anymore. So that was causing issues, especially with I think IPS displays. It was causing temporary retention on that. So it is a composite CRT filter, but it doesn't have that rapid noise effect anymore. So there shouldn't be concerns with image retention or anything like that.
There's 20 games available day one. When we were working on this, I went back to check out the NES just to see how it's changed in the year since. And the game lineup on the NES it's pretty bad. I don't know if you've looked at it recently, but it is like the amount of games on there is pretty terrible.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some missing games that would be really nice to have on there. But I am also impressed that there's, Vice Project Doom. I mean, I was kind of like, what? Like, I would not expect that game to be on there. And that is a very good, sort of later third-party NES game. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of games that I would have liked to have seen on the NES. But, I think my perspective with the lineups of both NES and Super Nintendo on the Switch is when the NES first came, I think people were disappointed it wasn't Virtual Console because you couldn't purchase them and just have them on your Switch forever. But for me personally, my perspective is I've, over the years, increasingly felt less and less ownership over my digital games. Now, just for subscribing to the online service that I would subscribe to anyway, boom, I've got a selection of 20 Super Nintendo games on my Switch that, hey, if I'm on an airplane or something, maybe I'll just play through Super Mario World. Maybe I'll, play a few worlds of Yoshi's Island, do a few cups of Mario Kart, see how far I can get in Super Metroid.
One thing I thought was very interesting is the selection of games is a lot different than I would expect. There is no Konami games this time, and I wonder if that has anything to do with the fact that the Contra and Castlevania Anniversary collections recently came out on Switch, so they have no way to put Contra 3 or Castlevania 4 on there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is very likely the reason why, and I don't know if that it could also be the reason why we don't have any Mega Man games, because Capcom has their collections to buy as well. And I think especially there's also no Squaresoft games.
Like a service like this, you won't see certain games because these collections with older games on them are really, like, there's so many of them coming out now that it limits services like this. Back when, when the Virtual Console was brand new, all this stuff was showing up on there because a service like that had never existed, or a lot of these compilations were never a thing. I mean, there was some on the PS2, but there was not a lot of console games being ported at the time to other platforms, and now they're all over the place. It took a lot of these companies a long time to realize that people wanted to play these old games, and now they finally understand that, and they're gonna sell them to you.
Yeah. So the selection of games we've got here at launch it's interesting. I mean, I think it's overall a pretty good selection. I mean, you've got a handful of, the obvious ones, the must plays, and a handful of games that are good, but maybe people haven't played that much. And a few kind of bad games. And honestly, I'm kind of glad to see those there too. I kind of think of it like the backwards compatibility on Xbox One.
One thing that I think that it's important to point out to people is that always create a save state before you exit out of a game to play something else. Even if you just back out to the menu, you will lose your place in the game because the game will reboot.
I'm pretty sure on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition, you can back out to the menu and jump back in because you actually make the save state in the menu rather than the in-game menu.
This has the ability to rewind, which was also present in the SNES Classic Edition, although I'm pretty sure its implementation in the NES Classic Edition wasn't nearly as seamless as this is. It was very, very helpful to be able to capture footage for this episode because Super Ghouls and Ghosts is an extremely difficult game, and I could kind of cheese my way through it just for capture purposes. And it's not something that we would use outside of capturing and variety of gameplay reasons. At least me. I know that you're very against using any kind of rewind function, fast forward, anything like that.
I completely forgot that function even existed. But even once you reminded me, I'm like, I can't bring myself to do it. I will admit though, that I did enjoy the fast forward feature in Final Fantasy XII The Zodiac Age, but I didn't think I would. Fast forward, I can see the value in. Rewind, kind of, it just doesn't work with my brain. Now, in docked mode with the 4:3 and CRT sizing modes, you've got a 4.5 times vertical scale, which if you set 4.5 on the Super NT, with the 16:9 sizing on that as well, the image quality is virtually identical because the Super NT has really good interpolation too. And the two are almost indistinguishable. It almost makes me wonder if Nintendo was looking at the Super NT to sort of determine like what's the best way to represent this, which I mean, it's both, I would say, are the best visual representation I've ever seen of Super Nintendo games in 1080p. But the interpolation is like super good on both the NES app and the Super Nintendo app. I mean, the quality of the interpolation is almost identical. And for those who are unfamiliar, what we mean by interpolation is the pixel edges are softened just the teensiest bit, which makes them look uniform. Normally, Super Nintendo games are stretched by a CRT, which is, of course, the device they were originally meant to be seen on. The Super Nintendo games are 256 pixels wide, and so the pixels, as displayed in a 4:3 aspect ratio, actually should be a little wider than they are tall. And when you emulate that, sometimes it makes the pixels uneven sizes, and then when the screen scrolls, you get this like shimmering effect. And interpolation hides that, and it's really good interpolation on the 4:3 mode as well as the CRT filter. I mean, it's among the best I've ever seen. So visually, it's just a great representation.
It's so good, it's almost surprising they give you the option for a pixel perfect, because just playing a pixel perfect is going to look really skinny to most people on an HD TV.
Right. And not only is it very skinny, it's also a lot shorter because they're doing a 4x scale within a 1080p frame, at least in docked mode. And so you've got a ton of black space on the top and bottom. And again, it's skinny. Some people who grew up playing these games, like on PC emulators, they might be actually used to seeing them in this skinnier aspect, but it's not how they were originally meant to be presented. I haven't noticed any visual issues. I mean, it's not to say they might exist, but, and an interesting point about that too, we haven't noticed any anti-epilepsy stuff like the Super Nintendo and NES Classic Editions have this weird kind of like screen softening effect whenever there's like a rapid flicker effect or something similar. And maybe the games on there right now just don't have the right effects for it to kick in.
But speaking of Nintendo perhaps being behind the scenes inspired by the Super NT, we noticed something very interesting when it comes to Kirby's Dream Land 3.
Kirby's Dream Land 3 kind of uses this unique effect where it uses the Super Nintendo's high-res mode, which means that certain aspects can use 512 horizontal pixels, which is double 256, the normal resolution. Normally, this is used in certain games for especially for Japanese text, which can look a lot clearer when you have more resolution to work with. A lot of RPGs might use the high-res mode to have high-resolution text, like Treasure of the Rudras comes to mind. And Kirby's Dream Land 3 uses it in a unique way. I don't know of any other games that do this, where it uses it for transparency effects. The Super Nintendo normally can do transparency effects, and I'm not sure what technical reason was chosen in particular for Kirby's Dream Land 3 to use these kind of alternating lines. But on a CRT, those effects, especially with composite or S-video, they do look like transparency effects, but if you play like an RGB at high fidelity, you are going to get this dashed look with water or any other effects that are supposed to look transparent, specifically in Kirby's Dream Land 3. And the Super NT has this function that actually lets you blend them to make it look like true transparency. I don't know if that is, to be honest, I don't know if that is an original Kevtris idea. I don't know if that's a feature that's been in other emulators, but we checked. Up to this point, Nintendo has not done that effect on previous releases of Kirby's Dream Land 3, like the Kirby's Dream Collection on the Wii or on the Wii U Virtual Console. It does not have that presentation. So that's a cool feature that they've got in the emulator is just specific to that game. The NES and Super Nintendo Switch emulation apps have been actually built by a European development branch that Nintendo has had for several years, who's kind of developed sort of more of the software technology sides of things, like the Super Stable 3D on the new 3DS, for example. And they've also done the emulation on the NES and SNES Classic Editions. So it's interesting to see that sort of difference in emulation in the work from the same division. But, overall, I have been very impressed with what they have done, especially starting with the SNES Classic Edition, because they are doing interpolation, which not nearly enough people are doing. And to me, it is so important. Even M2 isn't really consistently doing interpolation correctly. So to me, that's a big deal. And I know I'm harping on interpolation a lot.
You say it out of love. Like, you want this in all these other collections. And I think that it's an important aspect of it that more people should be taking advantage of. Another thing that you kind of noticed with this, and it's something that we've done some tests with to check out back and forth, is sound delay, which is a common thing in all kind of emulation that we've run into. We previously talked about it in the Genesis Mini. We've talked about it in various compilations. And what we found here is very, very good. It's there, but maybe 2 to 3 frames at the most. There's times where I may have noticed it a little bit more.
I mean, 2 to 3 frames, yeah, it'd be nice if it wasn't there at all, but it's not that bad, all things considered. And it may vary a bit. We don't really know why this happens. It might be because they're trying to adjust the system speed to match an even 60 hertz refresh of modern TVs or something like that.
And in terms of the quirks that we've seen in some of these games, for all intents and purposes, the things that we've noticed, at least that you've noticed, have all come down to audio.
I kind of had my ear open for anything that might jump out at me. And something that I thought might have been an issue at first was I heard a few audio pops. The easiest one to hear was in Yoshi's Island. When the next level appears on the map, it kind of does this little growing effect, and I heard a pop. But then I went back and listened to it on a real Super Nintendo, and behold, that popping sound effect is there too. So that's not a problem. I heard pops occasionally in other games, like with the Jetpack and Pilot Wings. A few times in Super Metroid, but it might have just been that I was listening for it. And I didn't go back and check those on original hardware, but it's entirely possible those issues are there as well.
I think it's important to state just with that example that based on what we found, it's only because we played these games so much.
But I will say there is at least one instance that I ran across that had a very obviously incorrect sound effect. And that is when you beat the first castle in Super Mario World and Mario jumps on the button that sends the fuse to go blow up the castle, that sound effect immediately jumped out at me. I'm like, that is not what it normally sounds like. Aside from the fact that they won't let me turn off the border and won't let me turn off the player indicator, I think the European Development Division is doing a very good job. And speaking of which, we did try the online co-op mode, which we're both using wired connections with our Switch, using that USB Ethernet adapter. But I was shocked. You were hosting, and there was probably some added lag, but it was not particularly noticeable. when we tested it with the NES, we did feel more lag, but I think at that time we may have been using wireless connections still.
You were using wireless and I was wired, because I basically have used wired since I got the system, because I'm using the same wired adapter that I used with my Wii U.
It was by far the best experience I have ever had with a multiplayer mode hacked into a retro game. And granted, I don't have a ton of experience with stuff like that, but like, for example, we did that with the Genesis Collection on the Xbox One, and you know, it was I was able to adapt to the lag, but it was there. I'm sure there's lag here, but it was a pretty good experience in the little bit we played. And sort of another fun thing to point out, again, you can do this in the NES app as well, but you can play a single player game like Breath of Fire, and I can watch you play. So for people that don't have the means to stream, that's a great way for them to, you know, just have a friend play their game with you.
Exactly. I think of it as a way, you know, I used to like to go over to my friend's house and watch them play through games, and this is kind of like a modern version of doing that.
Now, aside from, you know, any possible lag in the online play, I do think it's important to, you know, address that, you know, because this is software emulation, there will almost inevitably be some degree of input lag. We don't have any firm measurements on that, but we know it's there. It's still a good experience to me. I can very easily adapt to a situation where input lag is introduced to a retro game. I'm not overly lag sensitive. I think it's pretty good. I think a lot of people are going to make wild claims like, oh, I didn't feel any input lag, or there's absolutely no input lag, or you're wrong, there's no input lag. A lot of people want to think that. It's not true. People need to stop saying that. There is going to be lag in software emulation, unless you have like that more newer look ahead mode, but you're not going to see something like that in this.
I guess talking about lag, that's kind of a good jumping off point to talk about controller options. One of the things I am excited about is that Nintendo has this really cool, like, replica version of the SNES controller coming out, and it looks like it's going to be a lot better than the NES replicas that came out for, you know, the previous service.
I'm really excited about, because even though they're really tiny, it does have ZR and ZL buttons, which is going to make it usable in any game that doesn't require analog sticks, which is a huge deal, because I personally have like kind of a lot of like retro styled games on the Switch, and I want to play them with D-pads. I don't love the D-pad on the official Pro controller, so I've mostly been using the 8BitDo SN30 Pro, but I will absolutely use the real deal Super Nintendo controllers instead of that.
I'm kind of curious about the 8BitDo SN30 Pro Plus that has the grips on it. I'm curious to see if that'll be even better. Even though it doesn't have the exact form factor as a Super Nintendo controller, I'm curious to see if the D-pad is better.
So yeah, I guess that's all that needs to be said for now. You know, Nintendo has announced that they are putting an end to the monthly additions to the NES Switch app, and that is also going to be the case on the Super Nintendo. They're going to add more games to both apps, apparently, but it's not going to be on this regular schedule. So it'll be interesting to see how more come along. I personally wasn't really chomping at the bit and looking out for more games to come to the NES on Switch, because my preferred way to play NES is on original hardware. But like I said, I like to have these games just accessible to me for travel. And so it'll be good to have more Super Nintendo games on there in the future. But for now, I think the lineup is pretty decent, pretty well rounded. Obviously, I'd like to see more things. We'd both like to see more things. But you know, what can I say? The emulation is it's easily the best representation that Nintendo has ever done of Super Nintendo games in HD. It just visually, it looks fantastic. I wish you could get rid of the border, but it's, you know, that European team is doing some top-notch emulation. I really gotta say.
I recently had a chance to visit a classic-style arcade, and man, did it take me back. Thinking about it, I realized I hadn't been in an arcade like this in probably 12 or so years. Everything felt immediately familiar, and my senses made everything come rushing back. Had it really been so long?
This experience got me thinking about a lot of things, and one thing that really stuck with me was that feeling you had every time you'd leave the arcade. Now, if you're old enough to have frequented one, then you know exactly what I mean. You wanted to have that game that you just played at home on your console of choice. In your mind, that game would look, sound, and play exactly like its arcade counterpart.
For many game generations, the idea that you could have that exact arcade-perfect port at home seemed impossible. The consoles just weren't powerful enough, and all the wishing in the world wasn't going to make that Master System version of Afterburner any closer to the arcade.
Thinking back to it now, the thing I find most fascinating about this time was the way the developers would fit these huge arcade games onto this tiny little cartridge. Sometimes the only thing that they would have in common is their name. In these upcoming episodes, I'm going to take a look at some of the more notable arcade to console ports. Hey, it should be fun.
The arcade version of Rygar was released by Tecmo in 1986, well before they had any Ninja Gaidens or Dead or Alives under their belt. It tended to be just one of those games that I'd play at the local theme park the 1 or 2 times I would go during the summer. Nothing more, nothing less. As the story goes, Rygar is some sort of legendary hero who is out to save the fantasy world of Argul. He wields this spiked shield that's attached to a chain called the disc armor for a weapon. It's a pretty unique idea, but functionally it's just your typical blunt object used to smack some demons around. Being tethered to a chain gives the player a tiny bit more freedom than we're used to with these kind of things, like being able to swing it in an arch over your head. This gives you some vertical and zoning attacks that come in handy in a pinch. Another nice thing is that via the collection of power-ups, your reach becomes longer and longer. If you last long enough, you'll become a force of nature, and that's a big if. This is your typical quarter muncher, so be prepared to die a lot. I mean, constantly. Each of the 27 rounds adhere to your basic side-scrolling elements. There's no real exploring, though the occasional vertical passages do give a nice sense of progression. You can track your progress through each round with this handy little mini-map in the lower right-hand corner. The graphics are okay. There's some nice parallax scrolling here and there, but you're not really going to have a chance to look closely at anything because you're just constantly being bombarded with enemies from every direction. Each level ends with you gently picking up a statue and moving it aside to allow passage. Thanks for being so careful, Rygar.
I gotta say that I didn't really care for the arcade version of Rygar that much. It was just one of those games that maybe I'd drop a quarter into once in a while if I saw it. On the other hand, I think that my brother liked it a lot more than I did, because it was one of a handful of games that he asked for his birthday when he got his NES.
Tecmo brought Rygar to the NES in 1987, making some changes that would make it a much more interesting game. Tecmo was smart in realizing that home audiences were looking for something a bit longer and more bang for their buck. Rygar and his disc armor are back, but gone was the linearity and just about everything else. The quest in this port was a lot bigger. You can move freely through Argul looking for these awesome-looking meditating guys. Once you discover them, some give you cryptic hints to proceeding, but if you're lucky, some will give you important items like a grappling hook, crossbow, or a pulley that open up new sections of the world. These overhead sections are pretty cool. They spice up the adventure with a little bit of variety. It's very apparent that the development team was interested in crafting something a bit more interesting in this version. If this overall style sounds familiar, that's because it is. We'd recently seen this style in Metroid a year earlier. I actually find it pretty interesting that this game doesn't get much credit for expanding the genre.
Rygar is a fairly tough game. Nintendo hard, if you will. You only start with 3 hit points, so you're going to get smacked around a whole bunch at the beginning. Luckily, with every enemy that you kill, you're an experience, and with that comes higher attack power and more life. You can even collect these little star things that allow you to cast spells.
You get unlimited continues, which is quite handy, if I'd only known about that as a kid. Funny story, it wasn't until revisiting this game for this video that I even discovered you could continue in general. The game kicks you back to the title screen with no visual cues that this was even an option. So I would usually just turn off the game, frustrated. I used to spend hours grinding hit points at the beginning just because I couldn't make it very far with just my playing skill. One time I even stayed home from school with the intent on finally beating it. I grinded hit points all day and made it to the last boss, where I was defeated. This whole unlimited continue thing could have saved me a lot of fear of returning to this game over the years. One noteworthy aspect of this version is just how great the soundtrack is. The arcade's only true decent track was probably the level end jingle, and even that's not that great. But the NES version has some very memorable notes right out of the gate. These aren't just themes, they're anthems.
I think it's fairly obvious just which one is the better game. The arcade version is okay, but there's just nothing really that special about it to me. The NES version, on the other hand, is great. If you haven't played it, you should definitely hunt it down. It's like under 10 bucks on eBay. Definitely worth it.
With our tips and tweaks episode on controller adapters, we found a lot more to talk about with each adapter than we expected. I loved all the different ways that I came up with to use a GameCube controller on N64 with the highly customizable RAFnet adapter. The episode became so unwieldy as Corey was editing it that we decided one device needed its own episode. Let's take a look at a receiver that lets you use modern wireless controllers on the NES. When I recently saw Analogue Interactive, makers of the Analogue NT, announce that they were partnering with 8-Bit Do, makers of wireless controllers for PC and mobile devices, to release a wireless receiver for the NES, I wasn't all that interested at first. But my NES is too far from where guests sit, and my controller extender's tight fit makes me feel like I'm going to break something. So I figured for 20 bucks it'd be worth giving a try. The big selling point of the retro receiver is that it's compatible with wireless controllers that you probably already have, those being the Wii Remote, WiiU Pro Controller, DualShock 3, and DualShock 4. I think the obvious go-to here is the Wii Remote. I'm used to playing Wii and Virtual Console games with the controller held NES style, so it already seems like the most accessible wireless NES controller. The system's controller port provides power to the receiver, and all you have to do is hit the unit's sync button, and then the sync button on your controller. And it works shockingly well. Believe it or not, I honestly don't believe the wireless adapter causes any perceptible input lag. While I'm hardly equipped for a scientific assessment, and there are some variables here, this slowed down comparison suggests an added delay of at most 1 frame, possibly less. I've had no drops or hiccups over extended play. At times I did think I was getting random A presses, but that's because I wasn't being careful with keeping my fingers away from the B trigger, which turns out to be rapid fire A. The Wii Remote's A button is rapid fire B. The classic controller is not supported, but I suppose it's possible a firmware update could change that. So this makes things easy. I can leave the retro receiver in my NES's second port, my friends can grab a Wii Remote and sit away from the console. It solves a problem I had and performs perhaps better than you might have expected. Of course, to cover it here on the show, I wanted to go more in depth on the retro receiver's capabilities, and that's where I ran into a bit of a snag. See, while trying to update the firmware, the micro USB port kinda broke. I contacted Analogue support and asked if there was any way I could get a replacement quickly because we were including the retro receiver in this episode, which thankfully they did, but to my surprise, they also sent 4 of 8-Bit Do's NES, Famicom, and Super Nintendo inspired wireless controllers, which allows me to show off more of the retro receiver's functionality than I expected to be able to. With a fresh retro receiver in my hands, I came to a bit of an embarrassing realization. See, the USB cable actually only goes in this much, which to me didn't look like it was in all the way. So I believe what happened was that I forced it too far in my original unit. Yeah, kinda dumb, but I like to think that I made that mistake so that maybe you wouldn't. Anyway, so let's look at several other ways you can use the retro receiver. The DualShock 3 doesn't have a sync button, so it requires a PC with 8-Bit Do's pairing software to link the two devices. For action games, most people probably prefer A mapped to X and B mapped to square. Thankfully, that's exactly what we've got here. Circle also acts as rapid A and triangle is rapid B. You can make the DualShock 4 go into a wireless pairing mode by holding PS and share until you see the light bar do a double blink. Button mapping is identical to the DualShock 3. WiiU Pro Controller support was added with an early firmware update. In this case, A is A and B is B. With the downward angle, it's not my preference, but I've had to get used to stuff like this before and I'm pretty okay with it. I couldn't notice any input lag while using any controller. As for the 8-Bit Do controllers, well, I had been hearing good things and I have to admit the feel does not disappoint. The shape and texture of the plastic, the press of the buttons, it's all shockingly spot on. It's obvious a lot of effort went into ensuring these controllers would provide a nostalgic experience with modern wireless technology. And if you know the pain of finding an SNES controller that feels right, that's saying a lot. You can see that the versions paying tribute to Nintendo's 8-bit stylings also include at least enough buttons to fully function as SNES controllers, which might be handy when connecting to a PC or mobile device. But since the retro receiver is for NES, functionality is limited to how button inputs are translated to NES commands. At first, 8-Bit Do controller buttons were mapped in the style of the WiiU Pro Controller. Recent firmware updates have mapped A to B and B to Y, similar to the PlayStation layout. I think it'd be nice if we had a choice, something like installing an alternate firmware, so that you could keep confirm on A and cancel on B for, say, RPGs. But even as it is, I'm pretty impressed with how the 8-Bit Do controllers function on the NES. I played through all of G.I. Joe with the NES 30 controller, and most of the time I just completely forgot about it. Which is the way it should be, right? I thought I would default to using Wii remotes with the retro receiver, which I still think is the biggest selling point, but since I have these, they might actually win out for me. You can actually use the retro receiver not just on the NES, AV Famicom, or Analogue NT, it even works with clone consoles and emulator boxes like the Retron 5. When I first tried the retro receiver on the Retron 5, button mapping was screwed up in a way that rendered games completely unplayable. Retron 5 support was fixed in a firmware update, shown here functioning correctly. But remember that there is some input lag inherent to the Retron 5's emulation. Of course, you can also use the Retro Receiver with Game Boy games on the Retron 5. But remember, the Retron 5 reads the Retro Receiver as an NES controller, which means that the system won't accept the SNES 30 or any of the other 8-bit Do controllers as suitable for SNES games. Which just makes me think about the potential here. I mean, if 8-bit Do would just make retro receivers for SNES and Genesis, I would be all about that. Firmware updates also improve pairing speed, and with the USB connection, you can even use the retro receiver as a Bluetooth dongle on a PC, and as a way to use some of these controllers with retro-style games on the PS3. In this case, you can use all of the buttons. I originally thought that I would simply use a Wii remote with the retro receiver so that player 2 could sit farther away. And even if that's all I ever did with it, I still would have easily gotten my $20 worth out of it. But having tested out its full functionality, it really does offer a lot of different ways to play. And while I think alternate button mappings would be a cool feature for the future, as it is, I'm pretty sure most any NES fan could find a controller to enjoy it with.
As a kid, I was a pretty big beat-em-up fan. I'd say I owe that a lot to Double Dragon. It's because of it that games like Final Fight and Streets of Rage were made. But the genre has been pretty quiet for a couple of years now, despite a few slipping through the cracks here and there. You know, games like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and the fantastic Double Dragon Neon. The Virtual Console helped me play some of the games that I missed out as a kid, but one game has eluded me for years now. Super Double Dragon by Technos. All the way from seeing it on the cover of EGM on vacation when I was probably 14 years old, to recently at MagFest. And I decided to finally hunt it down and play it for real. My search led me to some interesting tidbits about Super Double Dragon that I had never had any idea about. The first, that it was called Return of Double Dragon in Japan, and secondly, that version had several tweaks to the gameplay. These range from slightly different combos between the brothers, various health levels of enemies, allowing a difficulty and continue select, and having the story removed almost entirely. It seems the US version was rushed to release for whatever reason, and Technos was able to go back and work on the game a bit more, resulting in what most people that have played both to be the superior game. So I decided to track that version down instead of the US version. Right out of the gate, I was immediately unimpressed. That Double Dragon theme music that I love so much did not sound good coming out of the usually amazing Super NES sound chip. Overall, this sounds totally flat and boring. It's very possible that I've been forever spoiled because of Jake Kaufman's perfect rendition in Double Dragon Neon. I'd argue that even the NES version sounds better. I think Return of Double Dragon's goal, to differentiate its gameplay from the pack of other brawlers at the time, is kinda what saves it a little bit. Instead of going from the grappling focus that was standardized in Final Fight, Double Dragon introduces a block and counter mechanic. If you hit B as soon as an enemy throws a punch, you catch their arm and you can do what you will with them. The focus on defense slows down the pace quite a bit and justifies the game's slower overall movement speed. Punching and kicking are standard. I mean, what kind of brawler would it be without these? If you hold the shoulder button and combine that with the press of the attack button, you get a couple of higher powered attacks. And if you manage to let your dragon power make it to the halfway point without taking a hit, you get to do this. I wonder what this is inspired by. Maxing out your power lets you go into Hulk mode, where you can knock down your enemies with one hit. This is good for crowd control, but it almost feels like you do more damage with regular combos than you do when you're in this mode. Remember when I mentioned the slower overall movement speed? Return of Double Dragon is slow. Actually, it's kind of annoyingly slow until you adjust to it. compared to its peers at the time, everything feels choppy, like there's almost something wrong with it. I was kind of shocked because I've gotten accustomed to the faster pace of, like every single brawler ever. Graphically, we got a pretty mixed bag here. Return of Double Dragon starts out strong in the streets of Las Vegas and continues to kind of get worse and worse. In fact, I go as far as to say that there's nothing here that is particularly impressive. Enemy variety is pretty limited, about 5 or 6 types overall, with one enemy even being a palette swap of the main characters. It just feels super lazy. I think with the removal of any kind of story from the US version makes the game kind of feel incomplete. I can't see how much there even is in that version, but the levels here end abruptly and you weren't even sure you were facing a boss. There's no change in music or anything. It's weird, during the last level you can even jump on the walls with spikes. Not even enemies take damage if you knock them into it. You think they just forgot to do anything about this? Apparently one of the areas that they changed from the US version was adding some significant length to the last level, which might have been overkill because as far as I can tell, the last level is about as long as every other level combined. And once you beat it, nothing. Just a credit roll. Damn. After years of intrigue, finally playing Return of Double Dragon proved to be disappointing. I'm not saying that it's bad, it's just not that good for much beyond a playthrough or two. There's lots of other games just like it that you've already played, and you should really just go and play those again.
Oh, Nestor, times are changing. This is the September 1997 issue of Nintendo Power, and for me it is without a doubt the most influential and most referenced issue of any magazine. What makes it so special? Well, it's the 100th issue of Nintendo Power, and they made a pretty big deal out of it. Now, I'd only been a subscriber since the previous Christmas, but even though I wasn't yet a long-time reader, I could really sense the excitement and build-up leading to this milestone. But there's one thing above all else that made this issue so important to me. Nintendo Power's list of the 100 best games of all time. Okay, so what's the big deal? There's like a billion best of all time lists out there and they just make everyone upset anyway. And come on, this list is obviously only going to feature Nintendo systems. But at the time, the internet wasn't what it is today, and I still had very limited opportunities to access it. I hadn't read a lot of other gaming magazines, and to me, this list seemed like a very good idea. And it really opened up my mind to the idea that games for older systems are still worth playing, something that obviously still hasn't left me to this day. You see, at the time, I had recently sold my NES, not realizing just how many great games were available that I'd never been exposed to. And even with the SNES, N64, and Game Boy, I was generally sticking to favorite series like Mario, Kirby, and Donkey Kong Country. But I was receptive to broadening my horizons and learning about great games that I hadn't played before. And in those days, it was pretty easy to get most older games for real cheap at stores like Funkoland. So you can see how this list became my most valued reference for my early adventures in retro gaming. Let's take a look at what people in 1997 were calling the best 100 games of all time. Alien 3, Ultima Quest of the Avatar, Super Tennis, Final Fight, Bust a Move. To be honest, I've never given any of these a lot of serious consideration, but correct me if I'm wrong to ignore them. I know that Final Fight is pretty loved, but brawlers aren't my usual genre. Alright, Kickle Cubicle. Now this is a perfect example of a game that I'd have never played without this list. Comparing it to Adventures of Lolo is all the convincing I needed. I love a good character-based puzzler, and Kickle Cubicle turned out to be pretty decent. I feel safe in deeming some random SNES golf game as skippable at this point. Hey, I forgot Gargoyle's Quest was even on this list. I actually never got around to it until very recently, and it was fantastic. It mixes overhead exploration with some truly excellent platforming. It's not expensive and is absolutely a top title in the Game Boy library. I tried Ogre Battle on the N64 on 2 occasions and just never could get into it, so I'm a bit wary of this series. Now this is funny. Lufia 2 is the game that people always say you gotta play, but I never hear much love for the first game. This one is way less expensive, but a friend tells me that the story is better if you play the second game first. Demon's Crest is actually the third Gargoyle's Quest game, and this list is what put it on my radar. Thankfully, I bought it not too long before the price skyrocketed. But unfortunately, I don't remember much about my playthrough. Definitely high up on my replay list. Battletoads, oh yeah! This got me looking into what games Rare had developed before Donkey Kong Country, one of my favorite developers at the time. I have beaten Battletoads without using any warps or cheats. The speeder bikes are infamous because they're so early in the game, but trust me, that part's easy in comparison to the worst this game has to offer. You know, I kinda went through a baseball phase when I was like 8 or so, but I don't remember Goonies 2 being here. I watched a friend play through it a while back, and it seems interesting, but I don't really know if it looked all that fun. Blackthorn caught my attention on this list, but sadly I've still never played it. The screenshot here gave me the impression that it was like Contra, but it seems more akin to slower paced games like Flashback. Illusion of Gaia. I did own this at one point thanks to this list. I played several hours but wasn't really feeling it. I keep questioning if I'd like it if I gave it another shot, but I watched a friend play a bit more and I'm still not all that sure if I'd be much of a fan. Metal Gear. Oh, the version that Hideo Kojima doesn't like. I never could get into the NES game. I played through the MSX version on the Metal Gear Solid HD collection, which was actually a really worthwhile experience. What? They thought Hybrid Heaven was going to be like Metal Gear for the N64? Oh, jeez. Dragon Warrior 4. Now, this is a darn fine choice. While I haven't played through it on NES yet, I did beat the DS version, and it's easily my second favorite game in the series, behind Dragon Quest VIII. I like the NES game engine way more than the style used by the DS remakes, so I'm really looking forward to it. I played through at least half of the Breath of Fire port on the Game Boy Advance, but to be honest, I thought it was pretty boring. I am interested in giving the PlayStation entries a shot someday though. Faceball 2000 on the Game Boy? I'm sorry, I can't be terribly optimistic about this one. I mean, the Super Nintendo version is pretty clunky as it is. Oh hey, it's that game Corey just did a video on. I have to admit, that video made me really want to play it. I'll definitely keep an eye out. Whoa, 2 Capcom Disney games in a row! And what a game this is! I've actually previously covered my memories of getting Rescue Rangers for Christmas. It went on to become the first game I ever beat, so I'll always remember it for that. I did own Turtles in Time at one point. I know it's the fan favorite, but it just never captured me quite like the port of the arcade game that's on the NES. Man, now that's my Turtles game. Gradius 3, or is it Gradius? I've got very limited shmup experience, but I did beat Life Force. It's not my go-to genre, but I feel like I should be more into it than I am. I have come close to buying this one several times. Super Ghouls and Ghosts. It's notoriously difficult, and it deserves it. But it is very good. This was actually the last game I beat in my backlog. I beat it on September 22nd, 2008. 0 unfinished games. Though lately I haven't done nearly as good of a job at keeping that number down. You know that one game that you didn't own but played all the time at a friend's house? That was RC Pro-Am for me. And sure enough, it was definitely more fun at my friend's house than when I later bought it for myself. Oh, and this is another game by Rare, by the way. Shadowgate was actually among the first set of games that I bought when I got a used NES in response to this list getting me all interested in the system again. Definitely a must-play for point-and-click adventure fans. Great music, too. Killer Instinct. Part of me wants to try this just as part of some effort to collect games made by Rare, but I'm really not a fighting game fan at all. If you ask me, the original Wario Land remains the best Wario Land to this day. One of the best games on Game Boy, and so fun to collect everything in. I actually just recently got Final Fantasy Legend, but I haven't started it yet. I love good old simple Japanese RPGs, so I'm looking forward to checking out the Saga series on Game Boy. I gave Double Dragon a pretty good shot. It gets tough, but I'm just not a bad enough dude to brawl with the dragons. Zombies Ate My Neighbors. Hard as crap, but I did beat it. It's okay. I do appreciate its spirit, but it's not that great of a game. I haven't played Final Fantasy Adventure in particular, but I did play through Sword of Mana, the GBA remake. I know that everyone kinda hates on that version, but I don't remember it being bad. Earthworm Jim's artists are no doubt talented, but I feel like their ambitious visuals got in the way of the gameplay. Not a personal favorite. Oh boy, Star Tropics. For the first 2 or so chapters, I thought it was pretty great, but the controls are ill-suited to an action game, and I don't even want to get into how unfun the so-called puzzles are. Which makes me very sad because I love the atmosphere. I can't remember for sure if it was this list or other recommendations that got me to buy Blaster Master, but holy crap, boy howdy, is this ever one of the best NES games or what? It's a bit long and tough for a game with no saves or passwords, but it is absolutely not to be missed, and the soundtrack is easily one of the best on the system. Blast Core, or Blast Corps as I called it at the time, was one of the first games that I bought to branch out from my small and safe stable of favorite series that I'd generally been sticking to. I don't know if there's really anything that Blast Core can be compared to. Puzzle, action, what even is it? I don't know, but I like it. I'm still woefully behind on LucasArts adventure games. I've always been super curious about Maniac Mansion, but is the NES version even a good choice? I still can't believe that I've only played through Earthbound once. I'm just glad that I bought it years ago. Can you believe that there was a time in the late 90s when you could just walk into Funkoland, casually ask for Earthbound, and they'd simply pull it out of a drawer and you'd pay $30? Good times. There aren't too many options for action RPGs on the NES, but Crystalis is a great one. Pretty sure it was among my first set of NES purchases when I got back into the system. Is it just me, or does Crystalis seem like a game that Falcom would have developed? Mega Man X. Enough said, right? This one and X2 are the only X games that I truly love. I actually like the platforming in ActRaiser a lot more than I feel I should. I know the main draw to the game is the world-building sim, but something about the simplistic nature of the combat, along with good boss design, really made me get into everything about ActRaiser. Castlevania 4 was one of the harder games for me to find in the years following this list. I'm not sure if it's my personal favorite, but it's perhaps the easiest game to recommend to Castlevania newcomers. Alright, funny story. I decided to ask for retro games for Christmas one year, and Bionic Commando was one of my most wanted. My parents said that Funkoland didn't have Bionic Commando, so they recommended Commando instead. I'm sorry, there's just no contest here. No, hey, fighting game. Oh, hey, another fighting game. Nintendo Power was allowed to acknowledge the Genesis. You know that game that you have the vaguest memories of playing at a friend's house but forgot what it was except that it was awesome? I was pretty sure Contra was that game. Thankfully, I was right. Since then, it's become one of my favorite series. I know that Tetrasphere is fairly loved, that its music is a big part of that, but when I rented it, I hated both the gameplay and the music. Maybe that's just me. Ninja Gaiden 2, that's a solid choice to represent the series with. It's just as difficult as the first game, but also more fair. So what is Shadowrun exactly? It sort of looks like a Fallout type of RPG, maybe? I don't remember it being on this list, but the bits and pieces that I've seen of it lately have got me kinda curious. Isn't it funny that Mario 2 used to be the weird one, but now we kind of just accept it? With brilliant game design by Shigeru Miyamoto's team, and music by Koji Kondo, Mario 2 may be more than a bit different, but just because it's a reskinning of another game doesn't make it any less excellent. Contra 3 is amazing, though for me it's more in the middle of my favorite Contra games. But that still means it's pretty freaking amazing. Dr. Mario? Yeah, that game's alright. I remember my dad discouraged me from renting Lolo games, and I never understood why he hated me playing them so much. In retrospect, I'm pretty sure it's because they featured the exact same repetitive tune on every single level. Fantastic little puzzle adventures, though. Is this the slow version? Secret of Mana is a game that I started a bunch of times before I ever played through to the end. I always thought both its gameplay and music were kind of overrated. But I replayed it with 3 players during a Backloggery marathon stream a few years ago, and now I like everything about it so much more. And I even bought the soundtrack. Wow! You can sure tell this list was made in 1997, can't you? Even back in its day, Shadows of the Empire was a very divisive game. I enjoyed it a lot myself, but I suspect it would be very, very difficult to go back to. Never played this version of SimCity. I'm not huge into simulation-style games, but I wouldn't mind giving it a shot someday. The Donkey Kong Country series is, in my mind, pretty close to platforming perfection. They're straightforward, without bloated gameplay, and the level design is almost mathematical in how perfectly it introduces a new concept and then gradually ramps up the challenges surrounding those concepts over the course of a level. To this day, I think Pilot Wing 64 is one of the most satisfying flying experiences out there. fun challenges, great controls, and just plain relaxing. But perhaps most importantly, Little States is simply a blast to explore and discover new things in. Pilot Wings Resort on the 3DS is a very good and underrated follow-up, but unless a future Pilot Wings brings back a tiny United States to explore, it'll never match 64. As far as NES RPGs go, I generally prefer the Dragon Quest games to the original Final Fantasy, but I think it holds up in its own right. Unlike the Dragon Quest series, I personally feel that the remakes of the oldest Final Fantasies are a bit better than the 8-bit originals. Alright, the weird one of the Zelda series made the list too, and it deserves it. I wasn't a Zelda fan quite yet at the time of this issue, but playing a bit of Zelda 2 at my cousin's house cemented in my mind the look and feel of Hyrule. Sure, it's different, but as Nintendo Power says right here, it proved to be entertaining and challenging nonetheless. Oh hey Metroid, and Metroid 2! 2 Metroids in a row! I was always afraid of going back to these games, having played Super Metroid first. But you know, drawing your own map is actually a fun experience in its own right. Give it a try. It's funny how we criticize annualized series these days, but we tend to forget that it happened way back too. It's hard to believe that Donkey Kong Country 2 released only 1 year after the first game, while being even more perfect in its level design. Easily my favorite game in the series. Super Mario Kart is unquestionably the game that sold me on a Super Nintendo. I wasn't so sure I needed to bother my parents with asking for a system more powerful than the NES, but Mario Kart just blew me so far away that it finally gave me the courage to ask if maybe I could get one for Christmas. Punch-Out! Punch-Out, man! I don't even care about boxing, but Punch-Out is just too fun to be missed. I'm so terrible that Tyson himself took me every evening for most of a week to actually beat, but wow, what a satisfying accomplishment. I have pretty much zero concept of how football works, but it does make me happy that so many people still call an NES game the best of its kind. I spent a ton of time in Mario Paint. I wish I'd actually been smart enough to record my creations to tape. But one thing's for sure, it never helped teach me a darn thing about music. Okay. To be fair, I do hear that NBA Jam features some pretty fun mechanics, but there's just so many other games that I could play, you know? Anyway, Super Bomberman 2. I sort of enjoy Bomberman, but I've never been a huge fan. The multiplayer is just okay to me. Any recommendations for the Bomberman with the best single-player mode? Wow, Turok made the list, huh? We were easily impressed back then, weren't we? The original F-Zero has never done that much for me. I love Mode 7 graphics just as much as anyone, but this is one series that shone most brightly in the later polygonal 3D installments. I can't agree with putting DKC 3 above the first 2 games, but I still think it's a great game, just certainly not as great as DKC 2. Remember the phrase play control? That used to be a big one. Haven't heard it in years. Castlevania certainly has its own distinct brand of play control. It's tough to get used to, but dang, I sure do love this game. I used to not like RPGs, you know? I had no idea what RPG even meant on this game's title. All I knew is that it looked amazing. When I learned that RPG meant it was like Final Fantasy, I was very concerned. But as a Mario fan, I resolved to give it a shot. It went on to become the first RPG I loved and one of my most frequently replayed games ever. When this issue came out, I hadn't yet delved into the Mega Man series. Given 2's popularity, I'm surprised it's not the series representative here. You know, I used to think that the first wasn't all that good, but recent replays have gone a long way to change my mind. Mario RPG may have been the first RPG I loved, but I still didn't think that RPGs in general were for me. But after hearing enough glowing recommendations, I decided to take the plunge on Chrono Trigger. It was already worth about $75 in the late 90s, but its impact on me was well worth the cost. It may have not been my first RPG, but it was the one that turned me into a fan. Yoshi's Island was huge for me. It was the first game that I was actively aware of and anticipating before its release. At the time, I considered Yoshi to be my favorite game character, and Yoshi's story to be my most wanted upcoming game. But so far, Nintendo just hasn't come close to recapturing what made Yoshi's Island special. But I'm hopeful for Yoshi's Woolly World. Oh hey, another Yoshi game. This is the localized version of Japan's Panel Day Pon, or as my friends call it, Panel Day Awesome. While my personal favorite puzzler of this style is Wario's Woods, Tetris Attack is a very close second. Oh hey, another Yoshi game! Sorta. Don't get me wrong, I love Super Mario World, it's a fantastic game, but something about its look has always seemed a bit off to me. I think that's a big part of how I convinced myself for 3 years that, oh, NES is just good enough for me, I don't need no Super Nintendo. To this day, Wave Race 64 blows my mind. How did they pull off this technology so flawlessly in the first months of the N64's life? Sometimes racing games on older consoles just don't hold up. And I didn't even own Wave Race 64 until after the N64's day, but boy, let me tell ya, it's something pretty special. The first video game I ever played. When put into the context of other games from 1985, and even from a few years later, it's stunning to realize what this game really was. Even Nintendo's early NES titles are a far cry from this unbelievable achievement that to this day holds up as pretty much flawless. Star Fox 64 is pretty great. I wasn't yet a fan of the original SNES game, but I put a ton of time into doing everything that the N64 game had to offer. Remember the brilliant VHS promo that Nintendo Power sent out? I watched this so many times. Link's Awakening is a pretty special Zelda game. Not only is it likely the best game on the original Game Boy, but it somehow brought out a strong emotional connection to the world and characters that the Zelda series has since rarely come close to matching. It's almost unfathomable that Nintendo achieved this in black and white with an 8-bit handheld. I like the original Zelda. I played it at my cousin's house back in the day, but I didn't really get into it at the time. Of course, I own it now and I like it and all. It's a series that I identify with so much that I feel a little bad for not having more strong feelings on the original game. But oh yeah, it's good. Definitely play it. Alright, top 10, almost there. Final Fantasy IV. I watched a friend play bits of the SNES Final Fantasy games before, and that's where I got the idea that I didn't like RPGs. But after I played Chrono Trigger, I went back to experience the Final Fantasy games for myself. Nowadays, I actually respect FF4's rigid party structure and preset abilities more than I used to. Sounds like Nintendo Power had a bit of a scuffle debating FF4 versus FF6. Final Fantasy VI is my traditional answer to my favorite Final Fantasy game, but I have to admit I kinda love them all. Wow, having hardly been around any time at all, Nintendo Power just couldn't resist putting GoldenEye at number 7. It sounds like they weren't sure of the game's staying power, but they weren't wrong to predict it. Not only was it an enduring N64 staple, but its multiplayer mode redefined popular modern gaming as we know it, for better or worse. Though personally I had just as much fun messing with the open-ended single-player levels. When I first saw this list, I thought, wow, I had no idea this Metroid thing was a big deal. I got lucky and paid $6 for a complete in-box copy from my local rental store as they were clearing out space for the Dreamcast. The first time I tried it, I actually kinda didn't get it, and I had no idea what to do. I gave it another shot a few months later and thought it was the best thing ever. Well, as you may know, I think Super Mario Bros. 3 is pretty deserving of a number 1 spot, but hey, I'll take this. Well, no doubt, Mario Kart 64 was a frequent resident of my N64's cartridge slot. But nowadays, no one can really agree on what the best one is. Top 3. Tetris wouldn't have been my pick, but I can't deny its influence and popularity. I was fairly into Falling Blocks puzzlers at the time, but Tetris was never really a staple of mine, despite being my first. A Link to the Past. This appearing at the number 2 spot was a big head turner for me. Like Metroid, I hadn't yet grasped just what a huge deal Zelda was. I thought it was just something my cousin liked. I wanted to figure out why people loved the series so much and to not feel left out on the hype for the so-called Zelda 64. So I borrowed a copy from a friend and, well, I go by Triforce, so needless to say it had an impact. For a long time I did consider A Link to the Past to be my favorite game of all time. And on some days, I think it still could be. And finally, number 1, Super Mario 64. According to the blurb, it was a unanimous decision among Nintendo Power's 12 voters. And at the time, I'm pretty sure I remember agreeing with this choice. And as much as I've loved the later 3D Mario games, I've grumbled a bit about the shift towards slower movement with less momentum. Mario 64 just still feels so right to me. I don't know, a lot of people disagree and feel like it hasn't held up, but I just can't remember if any other game has so fully given me control of versatile acrobatics like this. Mario 64 is the game that isn't afraid to let you find your own way to do anything you want. Everyone tried to copy what Mario 64 did right, but it's hard to say if anyone ever did it better. And that's it. That's the list. It's amazing to see a lot of games here that were thought to have endured in 1997 but are now either forgotten at best or made fun of at worst. And at the time I certainly had played a whole lot of these games, but it was those that I hadn't yet played that made the biggest impression. Since then, word of mouth and other lists have been helpful guides for digging deeper and deeper into retro games. So the next time you see a top 10 or top 100 or top whatever list, instead of arguing about it or complaining that lists are so stupid or whatever, try looking at it as a potentially valuable resource. You might just discover a lot to love that you never would have even tried otherwise. I really don't care about cars. They take me from point A to point B. Now, this hasn't stopped me from enjoying a racing game here and there in the past. I actually used to rent stuff like Top Gear Rally back in the 90s, but pretty much all I can bring myself to care about anymore is Mario Kart and F-Zero. But about a year ago, I was in the arcade room at MagFest in Washington, D.C., and a buddy and I played a bit of Cruis'n Exotica. This really brought back a rush of nostalgia for Cruis'n USA. Not from the arcade, but the N64 version, which a good friend of mine bought during the game drought that followed the system's release in 1996. This is a game that I always accepted as being kind of bad, but we enjoyed playing it anyhow. I knew it would be a stupid decision, but I actually came close to buying a copy for myself way back when. But nowadays, when N64 racing games are worth about $5, it seems pretty harmless to give in to the guilty pleasure. So over the past year, not only have I revisited Cruis'n USA, but I've also checked out the other games in the series that I'd missed. So is there really something there, or was it better left as a fond memory? The hook of the series is that it's a linear racing game through famous locations. No laps, just a straightforward world tour of sorts. Or in the case of Cruis'n USA, a tour of the United States from California eastward to your destination in Washington, D.C. I think this is what appealed to me most back in the day, especially because we were in the early days of 3D graphics. It really felt like going on a road trip across the country and getting to see some well-known sights. Though in retrospect, the representation leaves a little bit to be desired.
So this is the Grand Canyon?
Not really. Scenery is very repetitive and scrolls past your vehicle in a distinctly choppy manner. And I have to say, there's a bit of a California bias here, don't you think? Give the East Coast and Midwest some love too. But hey, back then, who wasn't blown away by how realistic it was to have bugs splat on your windshield while driving through Iowa in first-person view? The game has a pretty darn good sense of speed and actually controls very easily. The only levels that have much in the way of tricky maneuvering are Chicago and Washington, D.C. Now, the game does require that you get first place to advance to the next race, but this is a breeze on lower difficulty levels. It would be a stretch to say that Cruis'n USA is much of a good game, but if you have any love or tolerance left for the 3D graphics of 1996, cruising across the US is still a pretty fun and mindless way to kill about 20 or so minutes. So, my friend that I was playing Cruis'n Exotica with back at the MagFest arcade room later found a cheap copy of Cruis'n World and gave it to me as a surprise. I'd never played Cruis'n World in the arcade or on the N64, and I was actually kind of immediately impressed. While I can't compare it to the arcade version, I felt like I was playing a smartly optimized port. Similar to the first game, the draw distance is not terribly far, but the coarse scenery blends well with the backgrounds, creating a colorful and appealing look. And even if the draw distance is lacking, it's a necessary sacrifice for a rock-solid 30 frames per second, which honestly feels like a bit of an accomplishment for the N64. So, all in all, it's surprisingly technically sound for a series that I had written off as being kind of bad. As you might expect, Cruis'n World takes you on a world tour that begins in Hawaii, goes through Japan, Australia, Africa, all through Europe, and then ends in Florida, where you catch a ride to the moon. Kind of cheating, don't you think? That's not exactly in the world. Cruis'n World is far less demanding than USA in terms of advancement. Only third or higher is required, but it's also more challenging on default difficulty settings. Compared to the easy breezy feel of the first game, World feels like it's trying to ground itself very slightly in reality. Very slightly. All I mean to say is that there is some feeling of weight to the vehicles, and that crashes and bad turns feel more punishing. This takes a bit away from the feeling of constant and easy movement, but does seem like a compromise that might have made the game appeal a bit more to racing fans. The developers also create a light trick system that adds a little bit to the gameplay. The most practical way to use tricks is to pop a wheelie by double tapping the gas, which lets you vault over other cars as you approach them from the rear, or get over oncoming traffic without any penalty. It's a pretty decent addition, but they made the tricks way more fun and easy to use in the third game, Cruis'n Exotica. I only just got this game, and to be honest, it's the reason I wanted to make a video on the series. Cruis'n Exotica turned out to be a lot harder than I expected it to be, but also a lot more fun. Just like the first game, you have to earn first place to advance, but now there are limited continues. The more miles you drive while making attempts at cruising mode, the more continues you'll have for the next time. This was a nice addition that let me get acquainted with the feel of the game without making an eventual victory too difficult to achieve, and made me spend a little more time with it than I probably would have otherwise, and I have to admit, I didn't really mind that. This is a dumb game, and it knows it's dumb, and it's all the better for it. It takes the trick system from Cruis'n World and makes it far more entertaining. Check it out. Flipping all over the place? It's hilarious. Similar to the first cruising game, there's not a whole lot that slows you down. In fact, there's even less in Exotica. You're moving forward and moving forward fast. Hitting stuff, going off the road a bit, it doesn't feel like any of that makes a huge difference compared to even slightly realistic racing games. Combining this light and easy feel with popping a wheelie results in something truly magical. You can flip over your opponent's cars or flip over oncoming traffic. And it looks kind of terrible, but it's so fun and lets you get ahead pretty easily. Not that the game is easy at all. It took some work to get through it, but it was a fun little journey. It's difficult for me to tell if all this flipping was technically all that beneficial in gaining ground and getting ahead, but it really made the game for me. If you're an N64 fan, I'd say that Cruis'n Exotica is the cruising game to get. So yeah, these are all pretty dumb games, but it's also obvious to me that they were built with some love and an understanding of the limits of the console that they were ported to. And even if each course features a pretty simple track design and repeated visuals, you get to visit a ton of places throughout the series. 41 locations across 3 games. Check it out! Golden Gate Park, San Francisco, US 101, the Redwood Forest, Beverly Hills, the LA Freeway, Death Valley, Arizona, the Grand Canyon, Iowa, Chicago, Indiana, Appalachia, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, Japan, Australia, China, Kenya, Egypt, Russia, Germany, Italy, France, England, Mexico, New York, Florida, the Moon, Korea, Atlantis, the Sahara, Hong Kong, Alaska, Las Vegas, India, Ireland, Holland, the Amazon, Tibet, and Mars. Even if the games aren't that impressive, they certainly have a ton of variety. I went into this journey with the Cruis'n Series expecting it to be a terrible idea, but you know, I'm glad I did it. I had a lot more fun than I expected, and I wouldn't have bothered to waste my time making a video about it if I hadn't. I'm probably just crazy though, so I'm certainly not giving these games a wholehearted recommendation, but beneath all their layers of age and overtly dumb design, I think there's still something worthwhile here. So the next time you run across a 90s racing game for $5 or $10 that you used to enjoy, well, maybe it's aged into a near redeemable pile of garbage, but hey, if you give it a chance, maybe not. Yeah.
1993 was a great time to be into video games. The 16-bit generation was in full swing, with both Sega and Nintendo finding ways to push their respective hardware. Sega did it with a hardware add-on like the Sega CD.
Hey! You still don't have a Sega CD?
While Nintendo took a different approach with the Super NES. Using tech developed by an 18-year-old Dylan Cuthbert and his team at Argonaut Software, the first graphical processing unit was born, and along with it, one of Nintendo's most unique and groundbreaking games, Star Fox. We'd seen polygons used in the occasional console game, but they didn't have the power to utilize them in any meaningful way. The Super FX changed all that. Calculations required for polygons were being handled by the chip, and this allowed for a greater number of them to be used at any given time. Things finally had real depth and scale that you'd never seen before on a home system. Star Fox definitely received a lot of attention in magazines, but it was hard to understand just how truly revolutionary it was until you saw it in motion. On June 23, 1993, the US was formally introduced to Fox McCloud, Slippy Toad, Falco Lombardi, and my personal favorite, Peppy Hare, and a game that took the forward-facing shooter and flipped it upside down. The genre became known as the on-rails shooter. I can pretty much pinpoint the exact moment I fell in love with Star Fox and the on-rails shooter in general. Upon arriving at Stage 3, the Space Armada, your ship comes out of light speed and you're instantly thrust into this immense space battle. It's like something out of Star Wars. Not only were you fighting tons of enemy spaceships, you actually got to fly inside the larger space cruisers, shooting the core and flying out the other side. I'd always dreamt of playing something like this, and here it was, better than I'd even thought possible. It was like Nintendo reached inside my head and pulled out exactly what I wanted to play. I think the Space Armada remains the very best level in any Star Fox game. A few weeks after its launch in the US, Nintendo put together a competition called the Super Star Fox Weekend. Held at thousands of stores across the US over the weekend of April 30th till May 2nd, 1993, gamers could win various prizes, while the top scorer would win a Star Fox flight jacket. The Super Star Fox Weekend used a cartridge that contained a unique version of the game. You're given 4 minutes to rack up as high of a score as possible across 3 levels. The first 2 are abridged versions of the first 2 levels from the full game, and Stage 3 being more of a bonus level where you fly through rings to supplement your score. Once time is up, so is your turn. I'd seen the ads and thought I'd never have a chance to participate, but to my surprise, it showed up at a local department store. And even crazier, by the end of the weekend, I'd landed the #1 position at my location. The 2,000 or so of cartridges used at each location remains one of the most sought-after rarities on the Super Nintendo to this day. You'll find it routinely starting at over $500 on eBay. Which figures because the only way you could acquire it was via an ad in the back of Nintendo Power. As well as the game sold, and despite a canceled at the 11th hour sequel, we wouldn't get a follow-up for a good 4 years on the Nintendo 64. "20 years later, the impression that Star Fox made is still recognized. The tech of the Super FX chip opened the gates for consoles that would follow. It's actually very surprising we've never seen a faithful and true remake of the original game. Sure, there was Star Fox 64, but that was more of a reboot than a remake, which was a pretty big disappointment for me. But let's save that story for another time. I am glad the first game got some love in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. It's very much deserved, especially with all the great music remixes. I always found it off that the sequels never did anything with the first game's amazing soundtrack. I should mention that months after the conclusion of the Super Weekend competition, I did get my flight jacket in the mail. Unpacking it, I put it in my bedroom closet where it sat for the next 20 years. I'd even forgotten I had it until recently. Maybe one day I'll wear it. Probably not.
The Game Boy library is loaded with titles that are easy to dismiss as downgrades from their console counterparts. At a glance, it's tough to tell the difference between a totally skippable port versus a full-fledged portable entry that can stand on its own alongside bigger siblings. But it's thanks to games like these that the Game Boy has made a bit of a comeback for me lately. Games I've ignored but have finally started getting around to giving a fair shot. So, I recently decided to play through the real third game in the Contra series. Initiate Operation C. When it comes to running and gunning and blowing up aliens, Contra is simply the best in the business. For my money, Contra has got to be the most fun 2D shooter series out there. The first two games, Contra and Super Contra, were adapted to the NES from the arcade, bringing extra levels and more finely tuned gameplay to the home console. Operation C, released for the Game Boy in 1991, became not only the first portable Contra, but also the first Contra to be originally designed for a consumer system. One of the things that I enjoy most about the Contra series is the sense that I've really gotten to know the game through the course of multiple attempts at finishing it. Honestly, I think it's kind of ridiculous that the original Contra appears on so many most difficult game of all time lists. In the grand scheme of things, even among NES games, it's really not one of the most difficult games out there, and I'm not even particularly good at them. But yes, Contra games are hard, and Operation C is no different. You're going to start from the beginning a lot of times. At a glance, it's clear that Operation C takes after the NES games more so than the arcade style. Definitely for the best if you ask me. The most obvious difference is that your horizontal movement speed, running if you will, is a bit slower than the NES games, but you'll get used to it. Aside from that, this really feels like a proper Contra experience. Lots of enemies, bullets flying everywhere, uncompromised action gameplay on the Game Boy. It's impressive, really. Operation C introduced a few cool things that the series took with it into the future. Machine gun is the default weapon? Nice! The homing missiles that you probably used more than you should have in Contra 3 appeared first, right here on the Game Boy. And it works way better than I would have guessed. Probably the best weapon in the game. The signature weapon of the series, the famous spread shot, can actually be upgraded by picking up a second S icon. The spread is way wider with more bullets. But for whatever reason, this upgrade mechanic only applies to the spread shot. Still, this most likely served as the inspiration for the two-tiered upgrade mechanic that applies to every weapon in Contra 4. Best game in the series, by the way. These, plus the fire weapon, the good type with a big explosion, not the stupid, slow, spinny fire thing, are the only weapons in the game. A small assortment, but the nice thing is that you really can't go wrong with any of them. Operation C seems to have provided inspiration for Contra 4 in a few other areas, like the little scene at the start of each level, and Contra 4's harbor definitely seems to resemble Operation C's first level, especially with the submarine boss. Up to this point, the game has been pretty easy so far. If there's one mark against the Contra series, it's that most of the games are intent on offering some sort of alternate gameplay style that, while passable, is simply never as awesome as the side-scrolling stuff. Well, Operation C borrows from Super C and uses its overhead commando-style gameplay for levels 2 and 4. I'd have just preferred 2 extra traditional levels instead, but these are fine and work well enough. It's easy to see how you could mistake Operation C as a rehash of the other games in the series. I mean, Level 3 is pretty much just a mashup of the first 2 games' third levels, and the music, while it has its own twists, is for all intents and purposes just recycled for the Game Boy. Where things started getting really tough for me was the end of Level 3. This stupid little jump should not be this hard. I never did manage to hang on to any of the good weapons through Level 5, the final level, but once I figured out that you don't have to worry about platforms squishing you on this elevator, things weren't quite so bad anymore. Despite mostly unoriginal themes and heavy recycling, Operation C's level design is all its own, and will challenge Contra fans that are just looking for another run and gun to master. The boss designs are also completely new, and I thought were pretty good. So sure, it's not the most original Contra game, and its few innovations since became standard for the series. But for me, the most fun part of a Contra game is feeling like you're really getting to know the game over the course of multiple attempts. The famous extra lives codes just don't do them justice. You gotta learn to pick yourself back up after getting beat down and give it another go. It starts off so hard, but as you learn the game and finally beat it, you feel like you could totally do it again. And that's what makes a great Contra game, and even though it's a bit shorter, Operation C delivers. You probably know Game Freak as one of the company names that appear when you boot up a Pokémon game. Game Freak was actually founded as a magazine before getting into game development. And while it's true that they haven't developed very many games outside of Pokémon, they've actually made a few other very unique but much lesser known games, including platformers like Drill Dozer, one of the last great Game Boy Advance releases. But in this episode, we're going to take a look at another Game Freak developed platformer, released on the Super Nintendo almost 5 years before Pokémon. I'd never heard of Smart Ball until fairly recently, and I was surprised when I ran across a copy in a local store for only $5. I'd say that's a small price to pay for an interesting bit of Game Freak history. And check it out, published by Sony. So from the Americanized artwork, we see what looks like a real cool ball with some toot or whatever. A fierce-looking bird with fire raining down from the heavens upon a modern metropolis that we can probably assume is dark and gritty. Turn on the game and the illusion is shattered. Surprise! Smart Ball is actually loaded with bright colors and all of the cuteness that you'd expect from Japan, with absolutely no doomsday cityscapes to be seen. But there are firebirds that drop, fire. Well, Sony, you tried. So what we've really got here is a game known as Jerry Boy in Japan. And the main character is not so much a smart-mouthed ball as a cute little jelly blob. Oh, get it? Jelly? Jerry? Anyway, the story setup, which is totally excised from the North American version aside from the ending, is that Jerry is a prince who was turned into a jelly slime thing by a wizard because Jerry's brother was jealous of his fiancée, Princess Emmy. Jerry's abilities are fairly simple but different enough from the norm to feel refreshing. He can stick to walls and even ceilings. It would be nice if there were a way to leap from wall to wall, but it's still pretty neat. Attacks are a bit unique too. You sort of like stretch out by holding the up or down direction. If you time the hit right, the enemy you connect with will be defeated. It is a bit weird, but it works. You also collect red balls that spawn from plants. How nice that they tell you what you've picked up. You can hold up to 9 at a time and throw them at enemies in an arc. But you can also find a few other types of balls. Blue recovers your health, clear expands your health meter for the level, green grows a vine that helps you get to places that you couldn't reach otherwise, and white lets you jump much higher than normal. There's also an iron ball that slows you down, but it can pass through multiple enemies and can be reused. Pretty handy in the right situation. One annoying thing is that if you're carrying any upgrades, you can't pick up any health recovery or additional balls without dropping the item. Kind of a tough call sometimes, especially when it comes to the jump upgrade. The game does have infinite continues and actually has some pretty tricky stuff. It's not especially difficult and can be beaten in just a few hours, but it's also mildly frustrating at times. A sequel was supposedly cancelled by Sony at the last minute. It would have been great to see these mechanics expanded upon, but Smart Ball is still a pleasant little platformer that's just different enough to stand out on its own. If you see it for cheap, it's definitely worth picking up. As the credits roll, you'll see names like Satoshi Tajiri, founder of Game Freak and creator of Pokémon, as well as Ken Sugimori, Pokémon art director and lead designer of the original 151 Pokémon. It's kind of surreal to play a game made by the same people as Pokémon that has absolutely nothing to do with Pokémon. I wish that Game Freak had more opportunities to branch out from Pokémon because games like Smart Ball, Drill Dozer, and the relatively few other games that they've developed show that they're capable of far more than just RPGs. As it turns out, they've got a lot of fun and creative ideas for other genres too.
As a kid, I'll admit I wasn't too big of a reader. I never had that book that absolutely hooked me so much that I had to have more. Instead, it was video games that were my escapism of choice, and a majority of the reading that I did was firmly of the video game magazine kind. So if you were going to try to get me to do some heavy reading, your best bet would be to put something related to video games on the cover. Capitalizing on Nintendo fever that had swept the nation by the late 80s and early 90s, that's exactly what author and entrepreneur Seth Godin did with Worlds of Power, a series of books that were adapted from popular video games. Each was written by a different author under one pseudonym, FX9, and was aimed directly at young adults. My mom recently sold her house, my childhood home. While we were prepping to move her out, I unearthed almost a complete set of World of Power books from when I was a kid. Man, I loved them back then, but I barely remember anything at all from them. So I thought now would be the perfect time to revisit them. So let's start with volume number 1, Blaster Master.
Follow Jason into a mysterious underground cavern full of strange alien beings. Soon he's locked in battle with a gang of radioactive mutants, fighting to save the Earth from destruction. The complete story of the Nintendo action-adventure game, with loads of game-solving hints throughout.
You know, even as a kid, I knew that Blaster Master had a super flimsy story. Heck, that was part of the appeal for me. It felt like the kind of B-movie you'd see on a Saturday afternoon movie marathon. Jason Frudnick was your normal teenager. One day, his pet frog, named Fred, escapes from his aquarium. Hopping out of the house, Fred comes in contact with a radioactive box that causes him to grow in size. Then he sinks into a hole in the ground. Of course, Jason chases after him, and then he ends up finding a four-wheeled tank buried deep within a subterranean passageway. The book follows this setup to a T, but it doesn't take long before the author begins to take some liberties with the story. Instead of just discovering the tank and going after Fred like in the game, Jason meets an alien girl named Eve. Now, Eve is the lone survivor of an advanced civilization that was eradicated by an evil alien creature, the hilariously named Plutonium Boss. Using her tank, called Sophia III, she has tracked the alien entity here to Earth. What's kind of weird about all this is how close it seems to the story of the Japanese version of Blaster Master, called Metafight. The story and setting in that game is totally different, but you have a girl named Nora Satellite who is the only survivor of an attack by an evil intergalactic emperor bent on total domination. Come on, that has got to be a coincidence, right? There's no way that Sunsoft gave the author of this book the materials from the Japanese game to draw inspiration from. Maybe a developer would do such a thing these days, but in 1990, no way. Before you know it, Eve hands Jason a flight suit, helmet, and laser gun, and they're off to save the world. You know, I never really thought of game worlds and enemies in real-world context. Describing things that just make sense in games and transferring them to another medium doesn't always work so great. It's here that the author really seems to struggle, to sometimes hilarious results.
What is that thing? Was all Jason could say. Standing in front of a thick wooden door was a guard. Its eyes stared at them from high above, and when its mouth opened, its chin scraped the ground. All Jason and Eve could do was stare in shock. Then 3 deadly missiles shot out of its mouth.
In the game, Jason often has to jump out of the Sophia and explore on foot. I never liked playing these segments in the game, but a majority of the action in the book is spent outside the vehicle. While searching for more energy power for the Sophia, Jason stumbles upon the first underboss. He's greeted with the same clanging alert noise from the game. This entire battle is described in detail. Dodging some flames, Jason gets in close and kills the pulsating mass. Afterwards, he's convinced that that was the Plutonium Boss. Suddenly, a booming voice rings out through the underworld.
You thought that piffling pile of putrescent protoplasm was me? You thought that I, the Plutonium Boss, would let myself be outfought by a half-witted child?
Blaster Master dedicates a good portion of its 119 pages on the first 2 areas of the game, and most of that time is spent on only a couple of enemy encounters. The in-game levels are pretty big, so it seems like there could have been some more interesting predicaments for our heroes to get into. After Jason takes down the giant crab in level 2, he returns to Sophia to find that Eve has been kidnapped. At this point, the book completely glosses over levels 3 and 4 with just a few sentences.
Level 3 whizzed by in a hail of laser blasts and vaporizing robots. There, he was attacked by a group of 8 killer robots. Keeping his wits about him, Jason defeated them after a long battle. In level 4, Jason felt a rush of energy. When he got past this level, he would be halfway. The vehicle's power was becoming awesome. It could shoot in all directions, it could hover for long periods of time, it could climb walls and ride along the ceiling.
Obviously, the author didn't want to keep Jason on his own for too long. Hey, it'd probably be too difficult to keep that interesting, so it's only a matter of time before he rescues one of his classmates, this kid named Alex who has been in the underground for 2 weeks. He's been tortured and experimented on, eventually just discarded by the Plutonium Boss. That's pretty rough for a kid's book, don't you think? The two fight together through level 5 and 6, finally arriving at level 7. At last, we get the big reveal. Fred, Jason's frog, has been mutated into a sick and twisted version of himself. Faced with the harsh reality that he must now kill his best friend, Jason goes into a full-on meltdown.
Jason grabbed Alex's shoulders. Listen to me, will you? You know the kind of stuff the Plutonium Boss is into? Genetic engineering, nuclear mutations. He turned my little pet frog into that thing.
After Alex finally talks Jason into brutally killing his pet frog, the underworld starts to crumble. It's here that the book finally escapes from the shackles of the source material, and just does whatever it wants to in order to rush to the conclusion. Completely foregoing the final area of the game, the kids are transported straight to the Plutonium Boss, who, in typical villainous fashion, reveals his grand plan. He's built a machine called the Cyclotron that will allow him to consume the Earth's resources instantly. A couple of well-placed laser shots to the contraption is all it takes to finally defeat the Plutonium Boss. After all that, there's no big battle with the true face of evil, a guy with a shield and a flaming whip. After escaping the collapsing underground, we're met with a happy ending. Jason wakes up in his bed convinced it was all a dream. Fred is somehow totally alive and safe.
Suddenly, Jason's face got serious. What about you, Eve? Where will you go now? I've told Alex's parents about my past, Eve said. They love that kind of stuff, Alex said. We'll tell everybody that Eve is a distant cousin who's been orphaned and Mom and Dad had to take her in. Eve promised to tell them all kinds of outer space stories.
You know, it's pretty admirable what the book is able to do with the source material. For better or worse, it stays pretty close before totally losing focus at the end. If anything, it made me appreciate just how stupid the entire story setup is. Hey, one thing is for sure though. Revisiting these books is a ton of fun, and 25 years on, I can kind of revel in how quirky and weird it is that they even exist. They're a relic from a time long past, and one of those oddities that made being in the video games in the 80s so much fun. I can't wait to check out the rest. While we were prepping to move her out, I unearthed almost a complete set of World.
Remember Taito? They're responsible for some of the most iconic arcade games of the 70s and 80s. But to be honest, I haven't actually played too many of them. Most of my Space Invaders experience comes from a knockoff called Avenger for the Commodore VIC-20. And then there's Bubble Bobble, but that's not really my thing. Back when I lived in Ohio, I was probably 8 or 9. I have this memory of going with my next door neighbor and his mom to Big Lots, and she said he could get a Nintendo game. Of course, that means you gotta pick something. So he ended up with this strange little game, Kiwi Kraze. I loved playing Kiwi Kraze at my neighbor's house. The character designs kind of made me think of Kirby, and I guess something about how it looked just appealed to me. But the coolest thing about Kiwi Kraze are these, I guess you can call them vehicles? You can steal these, maybe they're clouds from these gummy bears? And I think these are eggs? And like flying ostriches or emus or whatever. You hold the A button to fly up and release to fall. It feels very unique and satisfying. I do remember beating the first boss back then, but the game has limited continues and is actually fairly difficult. Between levels you'll see this island map. I seriously doubt that I knew back in 92 or 93 or whenever that Kiwi Kraze was set in a real place. And actually, if you live outside North America, you are much more likely to be familiar with Kiwi Kraze, but you know it by a different name, the New Zealand story. It's originally an arcade game from 1998, and it was ported to Master System, Mega Drive, Commodore 64, PC Engine, Amiga, and pretty much every other system of the day, especially consoles and computer systems that would be familiar to audiences in Europe, South America, and Japan. And as far as I can tell, the NES version was only released in North America and is the only version that North America ever got, until we got an arcade port on the Taito Legends compilation and a remake of sorts on the DS. I recently borrowed a copy of Taito Legends for the PS2 to see if the original arcade version could hold up to my nostalgia for the NES port. Obviously, the graphics are a lot more colorful and the sound is very different. As it turns out, the NES level design is actually pretty faithful to the original, but kind of compacted. Larger rooms use fewer tiles in the NES version, but the intent of the original design seems to carry over. One of the most significant differences is that the various vehicles control differently from one another. The ostrich things are fast and squirrely in the arcade version, but the eggs are kinda slow. Maybe they're actually tiny hot air balloons? The arcade also has vehicles and weapons that the NES version cut out, like the UFO, which is very easy to fly and shoots overpowered lasers. And the cane, which is simply an invincibility item on the NES, shoots fireballs that bounce all around the room. Warps are in the same locations in both versions, which are activated by shooting the empty space where they're hidden. The most interesting feature that was cut from the NES version involves heaven levels that you have a chance of visiting in areas 3, 4, and 5 when you get a game over. If you reach the goddess at the end of the level, you get an ending of sorts. What you actually want to do is avoid the goddess and find the secret exit, which lets you skip the rest of the level that you died on. Of course, having played the game on Taito Legends, which allowed for infinite continues, I didn't have to bleed quarters to reach the ending, but the game was still sufficiently brutal. Especially on the last level, which I spent over an hour on before I managed to get past its unforgiving slipperiness. So then I wanted to get an idea of what another console port was like, and I bought a copy of the Mega Drive version of the New Zealand story. I was particularly interested in this one because I read that it has totally different levels, almost like a sequel. Well, that's true to a point. Every level in the first area is new, aside from the returning whale boss. And the second area is different at first, until it starts to become Area 3 from the other versions, totally skips the second boss, and then takes you straight to a super frustrating version of the third boss. The third area continues to use recycled levels, and the memorable pirate ship is missing entirely. Level 4-1 is Mount Cook, the final level, making the whole game much shorter than the other versions, which end at 5-4. Despite being shorter and having more continues than the NES version, the New Zealand story on the Mega Drive is much more frustrating. I feel like it relies too much on mean enemy placement and overuse of enemies like these star things, which kill you by touch, unlike other enemies which kill you with attacks, something that I felt was relatively unique for a platformer in its day. So some of what made the game fun and special was taken away. I even expanded my Genesis's cartridge slot just so I could play it, and now I kind of regret that. Despite its less vivid graphics and the fact that some features are cut, the NES version still feels like the real deal. It has every level, aside from the heavens, and maybe it's my nostalgia talking, but it just feels right, and is easily my favorite of the 3 versions that I've played. A year or two after I had left Ohio for Delaware, I learned through old-fashioned letters that my neighbor had gotten a Genesis. Not too long after that, I guess he got rid of his Nintendo stuff because what did I find in the mail but a package with Kiwi Kraze. I hadn't even had my NES hooked up since I got my Super Nintendo, but I did bring it up out of the basement just to play Kiwi Kraze for a few minutes. Since I didn't really play the NES anymore, I soon sold it and all of my games, including Kiwi Kraze, to help save up for the N64. When I later realized how stupid this was, I got another NES and began to build a new collection. I found a copy of Kiwi Kraze at my local Funko Land, and of course I had to have it. Who knows, it may even be the same cart. I mean, how many copies of Kiwi Kraze could have been floating around in northern Delaware anyway? Years later, in 2008, I was nearing the end of my gaming backlog, which was heavily populated by some tough NES games, Kiwi Kraze being one of them. And you know, it's not an amazing game or anything, but by the time I actually beat it, I'd had a lot of fun with it, and I do think it's pretty good, beyond just nostalgia. It's kind of weird that Square Enix now owns Taito, even sending out Space Invaders goodies as member rewards. I doubt we'll see a New Zealand story revival anytime soon, if ever. There's certainly a lot more popular and valuable Taito properties to choose from. But as for me, I'll always remember Kiwi Kraze as my Taito game.